organizations before granting tax-exempt status, taking us back to the ill-fated lowest learner years. The Federal Election Commission will now be partisan. H.R. 1 alters the current bipartisan makeup of the 6-member commission to a partisan 5-member commission and also establishes a speech czar, limiting free speech and creating a partisan commission with partisan enforcement priorities. And after the bill attacks Americans' free speech, it creates a public fund to directly contribute to congressional campaigns. H.R. 1 would launder corporate dollars through the Treasury and use those dollars to publicly fund congressional campaigns. Based on 2020 numbers, that creates access to more than $7 million in public funds to bolster my colleagues' campaign coffers by providing a 6-to-1 funding match to small donations. I know when I speak with my constituents back home, establishing a program that helps me acquire more money for my campaign is not what they think the federal government should be working on. We've submitted amendments to not only strike this program and prevent all sitting members of Congress from financially benefiting, but also require any increase in corporate fines to be used to help with the pandemic relief. We believe helping our country through this pandemic is a better use of this money than lining our own campaign coffers. I hope my colleagues will agree and rule these amendments in order. Again, we're offering these 25 amendments because Republicans have been shut out of the process, and we believe this bill would have a negative impact on the American people's ability to vote and to participate in our political process. H.R. 1 includes election administration mandates that will be impossible for many states to implement, places restrictions on America's First Amendment right, guaranteeing freedom of speech. It creates a public financing program to line the campaign coffers of all members of Congress and makes pandemic election law changes permanent. As it's currently written, this bill is not for the American people. It's for the benefit of the politicians. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you for your comments, Ranking Member Davis. Disclosure requirements have been proven to not discourage political speech, by the way, but rather expand the public's political knowledge. So with that, I will now turn to Mr. Cole for any questions that he may have.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Chair Lofgren, you mentioned in your testimony that you'd had a hearing that dealt in part with H.R. 1. Did you happen to have a markup on the legislation as well?
No, as mentioned, I think in my opening statement, we did not. We followed the rule that the Rules Committee adopted and the House adopted that allows bills that passed last year to be considered this year without an additional markup. We thought, however, that having an additional hearing, even though not required, would be a good thing, and I thought it was a very successful hearing last week. H.R. 1 isn't new. It's a substantially similar version of the bill passed the House in 2019, as I said, after 5 different House committee hearings and a full committee markup process, as well as the Rules Committee, and as well as several other component parts in H.R. 1, including the SAFE Act and the SHIELD Act and the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act that were separately considered by the House. So there has been substantial scrutiny, and as I mentioned, we're simply following the rules as adopted by the House that do not require an additional markup for bills that are substantially similar to those passed by the House in the last Congress.
No, just for the record, so you know, that was not a rule I supported. You referred the bill to 11 other subcommittees. Do you know if any of them had a markup on the legislation?
I don't believe the House Administration Committee has the primary jurisdiction over this bill. There are some other committees with pieces of it, for example, Homeland on the security piece and Judiciary on the Voting Rights Act and the like. But I believe that all of the committees followed the rule that I've just discussed, which allows the bill to proceed without additional markups since it passed in the last Congress in substantially the same form.
Let me turn to you, Ranking Member Davis. Do you agree with that assessment? Do you think there was no need for a markup in this legislation?
Thank you, Ranking Member Cole. No, absolutely, there is a need for a markup of this legislation. While it seems like Groundhog Day that we're going through these failed policies once again, just like we did last year, just like this bill originally in the last Congress was written in the dark of night with the help of outside groups, dark money groups, under the guise of making good election reforms. That's not how we should put legislation forth in this country like they did in January of 2019. And we saw every single Democratic colleague of ours actually co-sponsor that legislation before it was even released. They didn't even read the bill. However, Ms. Lofgren is right. Chairperson Lofgren is right. They don't have to go through a markup because they're in the majority. But this bill is not the exact same failure that it was last year. They've actually doubled down and put hundreds of more pages into this legislation that would continue to take away our free speech rights and also nationalize the election process. As a matter of fact, just now, Chairperson Lofgren and the majority just put forth another 76-page manager's amendment. So this is not an open process. This is a process where Democrats are going to continue to push through 800+ page bills now with the manager's amendment, actually almost 900 pages, all under the guise of trying to game the system to allow Democrats to keep the majority and to really line their own campaign coffers with the first ever corporate money since 1907.
Mr. Cole, if I may, I think, Mr. Davis has introduced quite a number of amendments, as he has every right to do. And we have also suggested an amendment, as we have every right to do, and the Rules Committee, in its wisdom, will choose which to advance. I would just like to note that this bill had a markup last year, had a hearing last year, had a robust debate on the floor compared to when Republicans were in the majority. Their own bill, HR 1, there was not a single hearing or markup. The entire thing was done behind closed doors and was not made public until days before the committee markup. And the effort to repeal Obamacare, there was no hearing on the matter, no CBO score. So I think to criticize this when we did have a robust process last year is a bit disingenuous, but I don't want to quibble.
Let me go back to Mr. Davis. It's my understanding about 30% of the text of this is new. So none of that 30% has ever been subject to a markup. Is that correct?
That is correct. And that does not count the manager's amendment that was just released today. And look, I respect my good friend, Chairperson Lofgren. We work together on a lot of issues. This is one issue that we have some fundamental disagreements on, but she knows that the majority actually runs the Rules Committee. So let's not feign ignorance that this isn't going to pass and be added to the number of pages that we have yet to have a say in. Our amendments are amendments that we are forced to do that we could have done during a committee markup, Mr. Ranking Member, but unfortunately we didn't get the chance.
Thank you. Chair Lofgren, I want to turn to section 5111, which is this newly created government matching program for small donor contributions. The section creates a 6-to-1 government match for any small donor contributions of $200 or less to a congressional or presidential campaign, meaning that literally every $200 or less contribution or a $200 contribution could be matched by $1,200 from the federal government. It seems to me one of the concerns that I hear a lot is that there's too much money in campaigns already. And, why are you adding more? I mean, frankly, I don't know a single campaign in the country that was underfunded in the last congressional cycle. At least none of the significant campaigns were. Both sides seem to have more than enough resources. So why the need to tap into federal money, 6-to-1 match, and add even more millions and millions of dollars into the system?
Well, if I can, this is actually Representative Sarbanes' bill that was introduced in prior Congresses, and I think he's going to be a witness later. He may want to talk more fulsomely about the program, but the intent of it is to advance public interest, not special interests. Right now, big donors and wealthy special interests fund most campaigns. Even if not funding everyone's campaign directly, they're funding big super PACs, dark money groups. This pilot program would give political power to ordinary Americans and boost their influence and their voice in elections. The idea is to allow individual Americans to influence their candidates of choice through small donations that previously seemed inconsequential. But with this pilot program, those small donations would become very consequential because they would be matched. And so this would incentivize candidates to be listening to Main Street and not Wall Street. There are some similar programs across the country, and what we've seen is that they help increase candidate diversity so that more people can run for office and represent their communities. For example, in Connecticut, public financing helped far more diverse candidates win state office, and in Arizona, the number of Native American and Hispanic candidates nearly tripled after public financing was implemented. Candidates need to raise at least $50,000 from 1,000 small donors at $200 or less. And then there's a strict cap on the total amount. 50% of the average amount of the top 20 most expensive winning candidates from the prior election cycle. And in 2018, that would roughly equal $4.5 million per candidate. Now, everyone agrees that these
Money out of the federal treasury, and that to me is the main point. And frankly, don't we have enormously successful groups, Act Blue and Win Red, the two sides that do exactly what you want to do. That is try and take small donors and move them around the country. Those seem to have succeeded really admirably, I think, beyond what anybody believed they would. So,
well, Act Blue, and I can't speak
as a solution looking for a problem.
Act Blue is actually just a conduit, and I believe, although I don't believe I'm an expert on it, but I think the other, the Win Red group that was established by Republican supporters mirrors Act Blue. You'll correct me if I'm incorrect. It's just a conduit, and it is fully reported. It doesn't enhance.
Yeah, no, I'm not objecting to it. I mean, they all, but they injected millions of additional dollars on both sides. Again, I'm not being critical of the concept either way, but this idea that there's somehow a shortage of small dollar donors strikes me as, I mean, these two organizations seem to have addressed that pretty successfully. Let me ask you an additional question. Is there anything that would prevent somebody from giving a wealthy donor from giving $200 to every single campaign that they chose to do it, and then having their very substantial contribution, because they will have done it to maybe hundreds of candidates, then multiplied by using again taxpayer dollars to the tune of a $1,200 match for a $200 contribution? Well,
there is existing provisions, as you know, to require disclosure, and non-participating candidates, the existing disclosure rules would apply, which means that contributions that total less than $200 would not be disclosed. It's not possible that every candidate in either party or both parties could participate in this program, because there's not going to be enough money to allow every member of Congress to participate in the pilot. So
That's not exactly the question. I mean, the reality is if you got one rich guy that'll write a lot of $200 checks, as opposed to one small donor that maybe writes one or two $200 checks, isn't that going to be matched by the $1,200? And if, with all due respect, if you think those programs won't exist, they will. I can assure you, each party will go find major donors that are willing to write, you know, $100,000 worth of $200 checks or $50,000 worth of $200 checks, and then have them matched by federal dollars. Do you have any concern about that?
I don't. Candidates need to raise at least $50,000 from 1,000 small donors at $200 or less. I will say that because it's a pilot and there's a limit on the amount of money, only a few members, I mean, I don't know that it would depend on, the number would depend on the dollars spent in the prior Congress, and this pilot does not go into effect immediately. But the scenario you outlined has not in fact been the experience where this has been tried. So I guess
I can assure you it will be the experience. Let me turn to Mr. Davis. You've listened to the dialogue. Get your thoughts on the workability of this and the potential for abuse.
Well, I really appreciate being able to respond to this, Mr. Ranking Member. The bill introduced by our colleague, Mr. Sarbanes, that puts this provision forward was a disaster when it was a standalone bill. It was a disaster during the last Congress when they tried to use taxpayer dollars to create it, but then were called out during our markup process during the last Congress of HR 1, and they changed it to the first ever corporate dollars being laundered through the federal government to go directly into congressional campaigns. That's something that we even dove down further. Now, keep in mind, Chair Lofgren says that they may not have enough money in corporate funds. Well, Mr. Ranking Member, you and I both know Congress sets the authorized level of fines for people who are breaking federal law. So every chairman in a committee is going to be incentivized to raise the fine level to then be able to put money into their own campaigns. And mind you, corporations that break the law and right now fund things like the Crime Victims Assistance Fund with these fines that now would be taken away to line members of Congress's own personal campaign coffers.
It's not correct.
Those things are going to, those dollars now are going to go into this Freedom from Influence Fund. So Congress sets the level of these fines. So when Chair Lofgren says, we just may not have enough money to get to the limit that she mentioned was $4 million based upon 2018 numbers, well, I got to break it to you. I got the list now of the top 20 in 2020. 11 Democrats, 9 Republicans. But the limit that every member of Congress could then put into their own campaigns based on the 50% of the average would be $7.2 million. That is something that the American people are not asking for. They don't want more money in politics. And that's exactly what this provision does. I will say it again, and I've said it for years. My constituents do not want to have me be able to line my own campaign coffers with corporate dollars, tax dollars, publicly funded dollars, whatever they want to call it, through this laundering system that they've come up with, and enrich my campaign or your campaigns even more. And anybody who votes for this bill votes to put more money, capped out now at $7.2 million, into their own personal campaign coffers. It's wrong. We can change it by accepting one of my amendments to strike this language out. And it's one that we're going to continue to talk about as long as the majority continues to lie to the American people about what this is.
Let me, Ranking Member Davis, move to a different area. You actually mentioned in your testimony, and that's the changing of the ballots on the Federal Election Commission from 3 to 3, which keeps it bipartisan to 3 to 2, with no guarantee of a chairman and vice chairman of different parties. And this idea you talked about of empowering a free speech. So could you explain that and what the dangers of partisanizing the Federal Election Commission might be?
Absolutely. This is something that I think every member of Congress, Republican or Democrat, should be concerned about. I don't care if a Republican's in the White House, and I opposed it when this was brought up in the last Congress under a Republican president, and I'll oppose it again. We've had numerous former FEC commissioners write to us and talk to us about how they solve problems. Now, the FEC has been deadlocked, so much so that we have the chair who's actually about to finish a 20-year career and has not been confirmed for decades into her spot. That needs to change. That can change at the executive branch level. Let's get nominees from both parties to fill the seats so that the FEC can do their job. But to actually add a member to make it partisan would turn the FEC into a partisan organization. And right now, once fully equipped as well, now that's on. I certainly hope that President Biden can nominate FEC commissioners to keep it balanced so that when a decision is made to offer punishment or offer any advice to members of Congress running campaigns or anybody filing under the FEC, that it's bipartisan agreement for punishments rather than just another partisan commission that the American people are sick and tired of here in Washington, D.C.
Mr. Cole?
Yes, ma'am.
I just have to say that the FEC is completely dysfunctional at this point. I mean, they've deadlocked on votes. They're even numbered, and they deadlock, and there's increasing deadlocks. They couldn't even agree to hire a permanent general counsel for more than 7 years. So what we're suggesting is to change it from a 6-person commission to a 5-person commission. And contrary to the ranking member's suggestion, we don't want a partisan takeover of the FEC. So the provision mandates that no more than 2 of the 5 commissioners can be from the same political party. No one party could take over the commission. It also sets up a blue ribbon panel to help name nominees to the commission, so the nomination process will be more transparent. We can't go on without a referee. We've set up all these rules that are supposed to be enforced, and they're never enforced because the commission can't act. Ann Rabel, who was a member of the commission, who's someone I've known probably for 35 years. She got her start as in the county counsel's office when I was on the board of supervisors in Santa Clara County, and she ended up on the FEC as chair. And this is what she said: "It's worse than dysfunctional. It's the likelihood of the laws being enforced is slim." And she published a report in 2017 showing that there's an increase in deadlock votes in the last decade. We just can't let this go on. And I think that, Mr. Cole, thank you for letting me give my pitch on this.
Of course, Madam Chair, absolutely. Although I would just say I'd rather have a deadlock commission that was partisanized, and Cal is skeptical that either party, given the opportunity to effectively have 3 members, whether it has a partisan label on it or not, are not going to try and tilt that to their advantage. They will. And I think you'll get a succession of 3-2 votes that will sometimes favor Republicans and sometimes favor Democrats, just depending on who happens to have the ability to pack the commission. Let me move to a different area, Chair Lofgren. And I know you're aware in 2013, the IRS actually revealed that it selected primarily conservative organizations for intensive scrutiny based on their names and political positions. This led to not only years of investigations, but even a settlement by the Justice Department with more than 400 conservative nonprofits in 2017. In reaction to this, the Financial Services and General Government Appropriations Bill has carried a provision which would prevent the IRS from implementing new standards that would allow for the targeting of conservative groups yet again. This provision was just recently renewed, actually, in the omnibus spending bill last December, but this bill actually repeals that provision. Something happened that makes you think the IRS is going to act more appropriately than it did the last time it could use its power in a politically discriminatory way?
Well, I'm not sure that's correct, Mr. Cole, but obviously the IRS and no other agency of the federal government should single out groups for enforcement based on their political views. That's un-American and should never occur. I don't think this changes that. And if you would like to draw my attention to a provision that you think does accomplish that, I'd be happy to review it after the hearing.
Please look at section 4501, because we think that's what it does do. And of course, you're exactly right. Nobody would want this to happen, but the fact is it did. That's why the Justice Department had to settle with 400 different groups that it had discriminated against. Let me go to Ranking Member Davis. Do you have any concerns that repeal of this provision would have a chilling effect on free speech?
Absolutely, I do. We all saw what happened with Lois Lerner during the Obama administration when you put a political hack in charge of determining who's going to be granted tax exempt status. They used the politics and the political persuasions of groups to deny tax exempt status. It was wrong then, it's wrong now. But this goes back to the problem that I see with this entire bill, Mr. Ranking Member, that this is another attempt hidden in now almost 900 pages of legislation. It's just attempt after attempt to weaken our ability to stay nonpartisan. You know, we go back to the FEC. Now, the problem isn't that we ought to actually make the commission a partisan commission. We all ought to band together and ask the executive branch to nominate members. I mean, the current chair is a regular TV talk show guest, and she did all she could during the last administration to show how partisan she was against President Trump. Now, that's not what I want to lead a now unbalanced FEC. But when you look at the IRS, this is a problem. Look, I'm from Illinois, and I always said, unfortunately, a lot of things in Illinois should not be exported to Washington, D.C. But Lois Lerner's behavior, weaponizing the bureaucracy because you have a political agenda against free speech, is wrong. Free speech is free speech. I don't like everything that the other side says. And trust me, did I like the millions of dollars that were spent in dark money saying bad things about me during my last 4 out of 5 campaigns that I've run in my 50-50 district? No, but I speak from experience. And I can say that free speech matters. And when we have hundreds of pages of legislation with, and I certainly hope Chairperson Lofgren takes a look at that section, and maybe we can work together and amend this so that the Lois Lerner rule is not abolished, because we should be working together to ensure that no one, regardless of what party's in the executive branch, should ever put a political litmus test on free speech, let alone tax exempt status.
Well, thank both of you for your fulsome responses. Madam Chair, thank you for your generosity with the time. I think you can see we obviously have serious concerns about the legislation. I doubt there's going to be any significant Republican support for it if it stays in its current form. But again, thank you for your generosity with the time, and I yield back.
Well, I appreciate the comments and opinions of the ranking member. I must say that, personally, I disagree with much of what was stated as it relates to a pilot program. We had a very, very extensive debate around that issue. It is a pilot program. It is a volunteer system to donate into it should you wish to participate. And currently, I think as flawed as the Federal Election Commission is, there is a system in place to ensure that politicians or candidates for elected office do not enrich themselves or use political campaign money for their own personal needs and wants. I will offer as an example a former colleague of ours whose name should not be publicly disclosed at this time because all of you know who I'm talking about. But he and his wife found themselves in a prison cell as a result of misuse of campaign funds, including utilizing it to pay for hotel rooms to host his mistress. I'd like to move on though. And for the record, I would like to, without objection, I'd like to insert into the record a statement of administration policy on HR 1 and HR 1280. And moving on to our committee hearing, I will now call on Mr. Perlmutter for any statement or questions that he may have.
Thanks, Madam Chair. First thing is, I've got to say, I've heard the word fulsome 3 times today in this hearing, and I don't think I've heard the word fulsome in 5 years. So I just want to compliment those of you who've used that word, and thank you for that. Second, I'm a sponsor of both bills. So obviously I support both bills, HR 1 and George Floyd Justice in Policing. And with respect to HR 1 for the people, maybe unlike Mr. Davis doesn't want to export things from Illinois to the rest of the country, but I think we're prepared and we think Colorado has a fantastic election system, one that was really put into place by a couple of Republican secretaries of state. We have all mail-in balloting. We have, my guess is that this year we will have the highest percentage of voters of anywhere in the country. In the 18 election, we were second to Minnesota. In the 16 election, we were second to Oregon. And people in the state of Colorado take voting very seriously. They exercise their right. And we found our voting system to work very well for Democrats, Republicans, unaffiliated, libertarians, green, you name it. And we would like to see that system anywhere that wants to use it in the country, because we think it really does empower Americans to exercise their key right to vote. Which brings me kind of to my last point. And I want to thank Mr. Davis, just looking at some things here. I mean, you made a point, you don't want to nationalize elections, that you'd rather see it state by state. And I want to compliment you in that you didn't sign on to the amicus brief, you didn't vote to decertify Arizona, you didn't vote to decertify the Pennsylvania election. But the majority of the Republican Party in the House of Representatives did just that, saying we didn't like how Pennsylvania conducted their election. We didn't like how Arizona conducted its election. You want to talk about nationalizing a process and objecting to a particular state in the way they've conducted their affairs? So I just say to my friends, and I can't say it about you, Mr. Davis, but I would say to others in your party, don't get on the high horse and object to nationalizing elections when the big lie promulgated by Donald Trump and his henchmen was perpetuated by the votes to decertify Pennsylvania's election and Arizona's election. So with that, I'll yield back to the chair.
Thank you for yielding back. I will now recognize Ms. Reschenthaler.
Thanks, Chairperson. No, it's okay. Things are very fluid in today's society. I understand. Chairman,
Councilor
Ranking Member,
was often referred to Mr. Torres and then referred to as Norma. I deeply apologize.
Chair, I'm making light of the situation. It's all good. No offense taken. Ranking Member Davis, I just wanted to go back to the First Amendment. I know we were talking about First Amendment implications with the FEC, but I think it's broader than that. Could you expand on First Amendment implications of HR 1, please?
Thank you, my colleague, and let the record show at this time, it wasn't me hazing you, Mr. Reschenthaler. It was the chair of the committee. Sometimes I think the people that see these hearings on TV need to actually realize we can laugh at each other and laugh with each other. And I'm actually, if I could go back to something that Mr. Perlmutter said, I noticed that he did not mention that my Raiders beat his Broncos twice this year. Would like for him to admit that on TV and let me know which team was the better team.
Point of order, Madam Chair, not germane to the conversation.
Well, hey, look, I appreciate the opinions of everybody on this panel. We are going to agree on a lot of issues. We're going to disagree on a lot of issues. But I do know that what works in Colorado is working because the Colorado state officials and local officials took the years necessary to implement a system that allowed them to succeed in the way that Mr. Perlmutter believes that all others should succeed. But they got to choose that. And they are the ones who were able to put this system in place because the federal government wasn't telling them how to do it, what to do to implement their system. And I would argue that states like Oregon, Washington, and Colorado that have all vote by mail programs, that their programs that as they currently exist could be hindered by the implementation of HR 1. But free speech is free speech. And I know that we need to make sure that we do everything in our power to not weaponize the bureaucracy like the IRS or any other portion of the federal government to limit free speech. We may not like what someone says about us or about our policies that we support, but frankly, I don't like a lot of the things that people say about our view on HR 1. But that's okay. This is part of the deliberative legislative process. And I'm afraid that when you implement a speech czar at the FEC, that unfortunately there's going to be partisan litmus tests put in place. And that's something that we have to guard against. And we have to make sure that we never see the IRS weaponized against organizations just simply for the policies that they espouse.
Thank you, Ranking Member Davis. And also, just to shift gears here, what about election security? Do you think HR 1 would make us more or less susceptible to foreign interference in our elections?
Much more susceptible with the nationalizing of ballot harvesting, a process that's already been ripe with fraud. Remember, in the last Congress, we did not seat an elected Republican a member of Congress because the ballot harvesting, because a process that was illegal in North Carolina was used. That process that this gentleman, a Republican operative, used in North Carolina would have been completely legal in California. We introduced a motion to recommit during the last Congress that would have made sure that no foreign interference could have taken place when it comes to ballot harvesting. And the majority at the time voted against that motion to recommit. Can you imagine if our foreign adversaries knew that all they needed to do was go knock on doors to get ballots of their choice to influence our election? That's something that we have to be concerned about. And when you nationalize the process like HR 1 does, we run the risk of creating a nationalized election process. I believe, and from talking to election administrators across this great country, that our decentralized process, that our Constitution actually puts forth for this nation is a much safer process. We want to make sure that elections are the safest, most secure. And we've invested together in a bipartisan way over the last few years, hundreds of millions of dollars in making sure that we partner with our states and localities to guard against cybersecurity intrusions. It's working. It's working well. We need to continue to invest in those measures. But at the same time, let's not weaponize by nationalizing the election process those adversaries who want to disrupt our elections.
Thank you, Ranking Member Davis. I appreciate it. With that, I would go back to the chair.
Thank you. I will now recognize Mr. Raskin.
Madam Chair, thank you very much. And thanks to Chair Lofgren and Ranking Member Davis for their presentations here. I fear that we've gotten lost away in the trees and the weeds, and we're not looking at the forest of what HR 1 is about. This is the most important pro-democracy legislation in American history since the Voting Rights Act of 1965, as I read it. And I want to go through what some of the actual provisions really are, including universal automatic voter registration, so that all citizens get registered to vote and get to participate, because we should get much closer to those Western democracies where 100% of the people are participating rather than down around 50%. And so universal voter registration, same-day voter registration, restoration of voting rights to former prisoners is in there. The vast majority of states have already adopted it, but I think 6 or 7 states still disenfranchise people permanently if they've gone to jail or prison, even though they've gotten out and they've had every other right restored to them, but they keep denying them the right to vote. And we know that there's been a very big struggle in Florida about this. This would restore the voting rights of former prisoners. The legislation requires the use of voter verified permanent paper ballots, which is something of concern to people all over the country, with the introduction of computer scanning ballot machines. It also mandates, and this is one of the major features of the legislation to my mind, it mandates the use of independent redistricting commissions for congressional redistricting to get away from the gerrymandering, which is destroying the democratic choice of voters. But right now, in lots of states, the politicians choose the voters before the voters choose the politicians. And when we debated this last time, I remember my friend Mr. Davis and I went back and forth on this, where he was saying, well, he doesn't want unelected experts drawing congressional districts. In other words, it seems like our friends in the GOP are favoring politicians drawing their own districts. And if I got you wrong, Mr. Davis, please correct me. Why would anybody be against independent, nonpartisan redistricting panels as opposed to allowing whatever party happens to be in control to draw the districts and thereby gerrymander the outcomes in congressional races? This legislation, HR 1, will abolish gerrymandering in federal congressional elections. And we haven't heard anything about that, but this is an essential feature of it.
Jamie?
I'm sorry?
Jamie? Hey,
I'm happy to
you might have me mistaken with somebody else. Last time I said, being from Illinois, I actually like this provision because Illinois is one of the states that's most guilty of gerrymandering. So I think you might have me confused with somebody else.
Well, then I'm delighted to hear that. I must have confused you with another member of the House Administration Committee who was taking a very strong position that unelected people shouldn't be drawing districts. I'll go back and figure out who that was, but I stand corrected, Mr. Davis, and I'm thrilled to know that you support this provision, because to my mind, it's one of the central features of HR 1 that it will get rid of congressional gerrymandering, which is so frustrating to people around the country. Politicians should not be drawing their own districts. And I think we all should be able to agree on a bipartisan, multi-partisan, transpartisan, nonpartisan basis that it's not fair to have people predetermining who their own voters are going to be. So this also strengthens provisions related to the military people serving overseas and other overseas voters by requiring that they be sent absentee ballots 45 days before an election. And as well, the campaign finance provisions. For the life of me, I don't understand somebody can explain to me this argument about the free speech czar, but essentially there are successful experiments around the country of trying to get big private money out of our elections. It's all a question of who is going to be exercising influence over our legislative bodies and over our legislators. And if what we say is that people with big money are going to be able to call the shots, then we know we get something much more like plutocracy than democracy. So these matching fund systems say you go out and you get a bunch of small donors to contribute small amounts of money. And then once you've demonstrated your seriousness as a candidate, at that point, we make a public investment. That's where we get, all of the rhetoric about, the federal government giving money to politicians. The question is, who do you want to own the political agenda? Do you want big private donors who put the money in? Or do you want to say, we'll have a matching system where the public will take over and then we can oust the big money, the big money puppeteers from our politics? So I think that these systems, I've seen them in Maine, in Arizona, in New York City. We've got one in Montgomery County, Maryland. These systems are working to liberate politicians from having to essentially do the bidding of the biggest donors. And if there are ways to make elections cheaper, I'm all for that, Mr. Davis. I'm with you on it. But let's not say, that, well, elections are too expensive now, and this will just make them more expensive. The question is, who's paying for the campaigns, and who are the politicians beholden to? I think that becomes the critical question. So, there may be things that should be adjusted, but I can't, for the life of me, understand why anybody would oppose this comprehensive pro-democracy, pro-voting rights package. And but let me start with you, Mr. Davis, because you raised the point about a free speech czar, and you're speaking to somebody who's actually gotten the annual award of the ACLU for standing up for free speech. Okay, and I would put my record up against anybody in Congress, and maybe there's people who can beat me as a free speech advocate, but I am a big champion of free speech. So if you could tell me what that's all about, then you caught my attention, Mr. Davis.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you got the award from the ACLU. You might not get it this year for your support of HR 1 last time. I expect them to oppose this bill once again, but the speech czar is referenced in section 6003 of your bill. I would urge you to take a look at those provisions. But also,
it's called the speech czar.
That's what it's basically what it creates. You can call it what you want, but it.
Okay. Well, the reason I guess the reason I didn't notice it wasn't called the speech czar. So what are you?
It doesn't matter what something's called. If that's the end result, that's what you have. And as a matter of fact, as we look at the independent redistricting commissions, if you go back to this problem that we have in this entire bill, it's DC Democrats in the majority that will set the agenda and set the policies. Look, I'm for independent redistricting commissions in states like Illinois, but what's going to work? Are we going to have Washington, DC, and the majority Democrats in Congress be the ones to set these policies? Because you mentioned, Mr. Raskin, that the 6-to-1 match program is something that would take the control of money out of the hands of people here in America. But what you don't mention, sir, is that it will then be in the hands of everyone in this institution, because it's Congress that continues to set the levels of these corporate fines that this bill puts in place, that gets laundered through a process, through the taxpayers and into congressional campaigns. And at the same time, that money is not going to be reduced. It's going to add to the ever increased political spending that we see. If you look at just what Chairperson Lofgren mentioned from 2018 to 2020, the eligible amount that a candidate, that all of us on this call could have gotten put into our campaign coffers, if you meet a threshold that many of us in targeted races have already met, we could have put over $4 million directly into our campaigns in the last Congress. But because of the exponential rise in the ability of small dollar donors to participate freely in our election process, That new cap was raised in 2020 to $7.2 million. Don't think that that's not going to continue to go up. And it's going to create a beast
Mr. Davis,
that is going to be
take a minute.
self-regulated and self-funded by Congress every time a committee and a law is passed to raise corporate fines. This would be the first ever corporate money going directly into our campaigns since 1907.
Well, wait, that's
It's
not
wrong.
true.
It is true.
Okay, I'm going to come to Ms. Lofgren, but let me just say this because I don't want to confuse people out there. There's a Supreme Court decision called Citizens United, which opened the floodgates on corporate money coming into our politics. So when you keep saying that it's the first time in many decades, I don't
First time
know what.
since 1907, it goes directly into our re-elects, our congressional campaigns. You know, Mr. Raskin, as well as I do, we cannot accept
Okay,
corporate
well, look,
contributions.
if
This would
your
be
point-
corporate money.
All right, let me just reclaim my time for a second, because if your point is that the Citizens United decision was wrongly rendered, then we're 1,000% together on it. To me, it's a complete distortion of what a corporation is. A corporation exists for economic purposes, and that's why it has all of the advantages of perpetual life and limited liability and bankruptcy protection and so on. That's what a corporation is. It should not be involved in politics. As Justice White once said, that the corporation is the creature of the state, and the state need not permit its own creature to devour it, to consume it, okay? That's the situation we're in. But HR 1 is trying to deal with that problem. HR 1 has a whole set of provisions designed to get foreign corporate money out of our elections, so that corporations are not used as a vehicle for funneling foreign money into American campaigns. That's what HR 1 is trying to do. And we've seen this over the last several years. Terrible corruption of the process of foreign money, which is illegal, foreign national money, which is illegal in our elections, coming through corporations, because the corporations are allowed to have foreign stock owners and foreign agents and foreign officers and so on. There are provisions in HR 1 to try and deal with that problem, okay? And so, but I would think if you're a critic of Citizens United, which it sounds like you may be, you should be absolutely for HR 1. I want to make sure, though, before I go to Ms. Lofgren, that in something you just said, did you just retract your support for the redistricting commission provisions in this?
I'm for independent redistricting commissions, and that's something you and I agreed on during the last markup.
So you
and we
support
had
these
a markup.
provisions?
However, I will not support the provisions as written without being able to actually have a voice in how much control Congress is going to have in setting states' abilities to.
No,
put in
Congress has no
independent commissions.
control. Congress just requires, it mandates that there be independent redistricting commissions, but it's up to the state to set it up. So
I certainly hope that we can come up with a plan that Illinois and Maryland can work on together. But I do want to.
that's called HR 1. That's the
I would-
plan that all the states are working on together. It's called HR 1.
It's vague, and it's not going to be able to set up the commissions
All right.
as you and I both envisioned. But I would
You
like
know-
to say on Citizens United, Mr. Raskin, that it did not permit corporate dollars or foreign dollars to come into our election. That was not the Citizens United decision. But your solution
It
to
certainly
this
is. It
alleged,
certainly
your
is a good decision.
solution to this alleged foreign interference and corporate dollars coming in to America is to shut down that type of organization in
That's
HR
right. I
1,
don't think-
but
I don't
instead
think-
launder those same corporate
love to shut
dollars
it down.
through fines
I would love
into
to shut
your
it
own campaign.
Okay, well, look, I may stand corrected on having stood corrected before, because it sounds like you just retracted your support for the provisions in this bill, which actually do mandate independent redistricting commissions. I hope that you would continue to support them, or at least decide to support them, because this is a major problem and a major threat to democracy when we have politicians setting up their own districts. This is our opportunity to do it right now in H1. This is our chance to deal with it. Otherwise, it's very difficult, as you know, whether the Republicans are in control or the Democrats are in control, to get any state to unilaterally disarm and say, we will move away, unless you've got the initiative provision, and the initiative, then you can override what the state legislature is doing. But I do believe there are people in your party, not you, but there are people in your party who've made the calculation that the Republicans are gerrymandering in a lot more states because they control more state legislatures than Democrats are. And so they're not interested in national reform. And that's where the rhetoric of, pro-states' rights comes from in this very specific context, even when we've got, as Mr. Perlmutter says, this amazing effort that all these members of Congress just signed on to try to thwart and nullify election results in particular states, which a number of members just said that just goes way too far for me when you're trying to throw out certified election results in particular states. All right, Ms. Lofgren, let me come to you, okay? Well, first of all, can you clarify, is there a speech czar that is in
No.
HR 1? Because I couldn't find it anywhere.
That's because there is none. There have been criticism about the role of the FEC chair, who is permitted to do administrative tasks under the bill, but any enforcement efforts or policy matters would need a vote of the commission just as they do today. So it really is incorrect to suggest that there's some individual who's going to do all the enforcement by himself or herself. And to suggest that enforcing the disclosure laws is somehow against free speech, I think it's simply incorrect. If you take a look, and I did not agree with the Citizens United decision, but it's the law of the land because, agree with it or not, it's what the court said. But the decision itself said the remedy was disclosure. I believe it was Justice Kennedy who talked about the need, and along with 7 other justices, and this is what he said: the First Amendment protects political speech, and disclosure permits citizens and shareholders to react to the speech in a proper way. So while they unleashed limitless money by saying that limitless money was equivalent to speech, the remedy was disclosure, and we've never enacted the disclosure that they called for. We finally would do so in HR 1.
In fact, going all the way back to Buckley versus Vallejo in 1976, the bipartisan commitment, I think, of Congress and of the Supreme Court was to say that, well, whether or not you thought there should be limits on contributions or expenditures, everybody agrees that disclosure is perfectly permissible within the First Amendment. And that was part of Buckley. And again, it was part of Citizens United with Justice Kennedy's opinion, as you say. And now suddenly we're getting this attack on disclosure requirements as compulsory speech or a violation of the First Amendment. And you turn the chair of the FEC to a speech czar. That's a speech czar who can't even call a meeting of the FEC because it's set up for complete dysfunction. Let me go to that question for a second. Don't most federal agencies and commissions have an odd number of members?
Yes. Yeah, for an obvious reason, so they don't deadlock.
Right, so that they can actually get something done. And also, so it doesn't encourage partisan thinking. It's not like, well, there's this team on this side and that team on that side, but there's an odd number of people who can actually operate, and each one is encouraged to use his or her mind. So now we've got the FEC, which is set up like, a deadlocked town council between 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans. And so the whole point of moving to an odd number is to get away from that kind of partisan mentality and gridlock, and to allow the FEC to operate. It's just a huge waste of money to have millions of dollars going into the Federal Election Commission with their staff, with the members and so on, and they can't even meet and they can't render decisions. Isn't that right?
Yes, I think it's important to note on the Disclose Act in terms of corporate spending. The Disclose Act requires disclosures for groups that spend $10,000 or more on campaign ads. And it only requires a disclosure of donors who give $10,000 or more. Some have said, well, that would be a problem. People don't want to know how they're spending their money. It would catch people who are uninvolved in this. There's a way to make sure that only the politically active donors are disclosed, and that's by making campaign-related disbursements through a segregated bank account so that the organization doesn't have to disclose any donations that were not from the segregated bank account. The idea that dark money is good for the democracy, I think most Americans would disagree with, and I know that I do. I'd like to just say something else because there's been a lot of discussion about whether it's proper or in his opening statement, the ranking member even said constitutional for the federal government to assert itself in these elections. And I think here's what Article 1, Section 4 says. It says, the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, but the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations. That's what HR 1 is doing. We are saying that in these areas where we're seeing Republican legislatures primarily going to pass laws to prevent Americans from being able to cast their vote, that is not acceptable. And we are going to, by law or regulation, change that so that eligible voters in the United States can cast their vote. And I think it's a little disingenuous to complain about that because the Republican study group or study committee earlier this year endorsed something called the Save Democracy Act. Now, what would that bill do? It would establish national standards that would prohibit automatic voter registration, that would make it harder to cast a ballot, and would impose restrictive rules on vote tabulation. So I guess it's okay for the federal government to use the second phrase of Article 1, Section 4 if it's to restrict ballot access, but not okay if it helps every American cast a ballot. I
Thank you, Ms. Lofgren. I want to just close with 2 points. One,
Would the gentleman yield for just
oh
a
yes,
second?
by all means, Mr. Cole, of course.
Thank you very much, my friend. Just for the record, Ms. Lofgren, I did not say anything about constitutionality of that issue. I just
No.
reviewed my statement. So
No,
I
Mr.
just want
Davis
to be
did.
clear. Okay.
Mr.
Well, you said
Davis
the
did.
ranking member, so maybe I misunderstood. You meant your
We got
ranking.
a lot of ranking members.
Ranking member of the
We
House
have a lot of
Administration.
ranking members. Thank you very much. Just wanted to have the record reflect that. Thank you.
We try not to contradict our own ranking member on the Rules Committee. Thank you, Mr. Cole. So look, we haven't talked about the ethics provisions that are in here because it's not just about voting and administration of voting and campaign finance. It's also about ethics, and there are some sweeping, important ethics provisions in here. For example, on presidential conflicts of interest, something we've all gotten to know something about over the last 4 years. This provision in subtitle B of Title 8 requires the president and VP within 30 days of taking office to divest all financial interests that pose a conflict of interest and to disclose information about any business interests. I mean, this, to my mind, was the original sin of the last administration, that the president, upon taking office, instead of saying he was going to divest himself from hundreds of business interests and corporations from around the world, said he was just going to keep them going. And so we totally mixed private self-enrichment and profit-making with the business of government. White House ethics transparency is in here, requiring executive branch ethics waivers to be disclosed to the Office of Government Ethics and to the public, because this is the people's government. So we have a right to know what's going on with people who are in office. Ethics for the transition team, so that we get information about the roles of the members of the transition team to make sure that they are free of conflicts of interest. And then a whole set of ethics reforms relating to us, to Congress, including very significantly prohibiting members of Congress from serving on for-profit business corporation boards. Why are members of Congress who have taken a pledge to preserve and to uphold the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and to fight for the common good, why would we be serving on for-profit corporate boards? Can we not all agree, as a matter across lines of party, geography, ideology, and everything, that we have got to make sure that our values are lined up with devotion to the people and zealous pursuit of the public interest? I just think that's absolutely critical. It also prohibits members of Congress from using taxpayer funds to settle cases of employment discrimination that are brought against members. So if somebody's sued for sex discrimination or sexual harassment or whatever it might be, we should not be using government money to settle those suits. So I like that very much. All right. And let me just say finally, that back on the question of Citizens United, which really has fundamentally changed the character of politics in our country by opening the floodgates on corporate spending in American politics. There's a provision in HR 1, which I had introduced separately as a bill, which I called Shareholders United, which says, okay, if the premise of Citizens United by Justice Kennedy is that the corporation is speaking for the shareholders, and they're the ones who have First Amendment rights, because corporations don't have First Amendment rights. That belongs to people, but the idea is it's derivative of the rights of the shareholders. Well, then no corporation should be able to spend any money in politics without first getting a majority vote of the shareholders themselves. Again, I think that's something that cuts totally across party lines, ideological lines, geographic lines, that corporations should not be involved in politics in any way until first you've gotten a vote by the shareholders that they want their money to be spent in that way. Another really critical feature of HR 1. So, Madam Chair, forgive me for going on for so long, but I just think this is really important legislation. If I find any fault with it, it's that it's packed with too much good stuff and people don't understand everything that's in there. We've got a responsibility to try to educate people about the different pieces, from the universal automatic voter registration to the getting big money out of our politics, to getting foreign corporate money out of our politics, to all of these ethics provisions. This is sweeping pro-democracy, pro-public integrity legislation, and I'm thrilled to be able to support it, and I yield back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Raskin. And while the Rules Committee has a very liberal policy of ensuring that members and our guests are able to articulate their opinions and priorities, I will respectfully ask that folks try not to speak over each other. So with that, I am going to recognize Ms. Fischbach.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, I feel like I should just mention that this is another bill that is going to the floor without a committee markup, and continually I hear, well, we had a hearing last year. Well, as a freshman, and there are 62 freshmen this year, none of us were afforded the opportunity to see these in committee. And so I would like to just point that out to the majority, that there are members, about 15% of the members have not had the opportunity to deal with these. So continuing to bring these to the floor is just without any committee hearings this year. It just seems to totally disregard that the freshmen are allowed any input. But I just wanted to ask Ranking Member Davis, a piece of this bill would allow for a private right of action against a locality if voters wait more than 30 minutes. This does not it does not appear to be a well-conceived idea, and would be particularly burdensome in a district like mine, where it's small rural counties and townships. And I wanted to just give you the opportunity to expand on any of those additional requirements that would be mandated by bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. that would be problematic for the folks in my district.
Thank you, Ms. Fischbach, and welcome to the Rules Committee. Obviously, no one told you what the Rules Committee was going to be like. Spent a lot of time in here, aren't you? But no.
Well, Ranking Member, they don't tell you until you agree to do it. Then they tell you.
Well, you know what? Actually, some of the members on both sides of the aisle are very good friends, and you're with good folks. And we need this debate, which is why I'm glad to be here. Glad to put forth our differences. And one difference I have is in the provision that you mentioned. I'll go to my home county, my voting experience in 2020. My county clerk is a Democrat. He actually was one of my witnesses. And remember, in the minority, we have very few hearings in House administration. We had very few during the last Congress. And I get one witness. And I chose a Democrat elected official because I know Mike Genesi back in my hometown of Taylorville in Christian County, Illinois. He doesn't care about if you're Republican or Democrat. He wants elections to go off without a hitch. Mike came and testified about the impact of this top-down approach and what it would have on him and his ability to implement elections in my district, in my home county, in my election precinct. Well, this time, when I voted in the general election, I voted early. I went in on a Saturday morning and I watched Mike and his employees who were there at the courthouse in a county, my hometown's a little under 12,000 people. And I had to wait that day on a Saturday morning, 25 minutes to vote. Well, would it have gone faster if we didn't have COVID and Mike was going in between every voter and cleaning each machine or voting area that he had put together to properly have social distancing and make sure he limited the risk of any COVID spread? Of course. But what are you going to do if that would have gone 5 minutes longer for me? If one more person would have been in line? Are we going to have people that are there with, are we going to have poll watchers with stopwatches? And then we're going to have private rights of action that could be politically motivated as to where they stand and where they begin to actually put forth these different violations of timing. It's wrong. It's wrong to have this top-down approach. Let's let Democrats like Mike Genesi in Christian County, Illinois, determine how best to safely administer their elections. Because I can tell you from my own experience, one more voter, one more family walking into that courthouse that day before me, I would have gone over your timeline that's being set by Democrats in Washington, D.C., not by Democrats in Christian County. This bill mandates the use of drop boxes. It requires 15 days and 10 hours a day of early voting, even in all mail states. I mean, this is a provision that my colleague, Mr. Perlmutter, should be concerned about because it can disrupt the successful vote by mail programs that you have in Colorado and add on other unfunded mandates. This is what I'm concerned about. While there are provisions that we can work on agreeing together, like I would love for an independent commission for redistricting bill to be put forth on its own. Let's sit down, Mr. Raskin, and talk about where we agree. Let's see if we can come up with a plan to introduce this on its own, rather than being paired with these unfunded mandates, this top-down approach, also without being paired with policies that will put money into my own campaign and your own campaign. Now, if Ms. Fishbach, if you would mind, I'd like to address some of the issues that Mr. Raskin brought up during his questions. When it comes to constitutional law, look, I'm not a constitutional attorney like my colleague, Mr. Raskin, but my interpretation of the Constitution says that, some policies may be good ideas. Just as I mentioned, we don't want anybody to wait in long lines, but the Constitution simply does not permit Congress to mandate these issues. The states and localities must be involved. That's what the Constitution requires. My interpretation. I would rather, again, have Democrats like Mike Genesi in my home county setting how he's going to administer the elections and make sure that everybody has a chance to vote. We mentioned the FEC and the speech jar. I do believe that this new FEC chair, empowered by a partisan advantage, will become a free speech czar. The goal of the FEC is not to get things done. It's if they overreach, they actually can impact our citizens' rights to free speech. And we also heard from my colleague, Mr. Raskin, when it comes to disclosure. And disclosure of campaign spending is great. I'm all for it. We do it. Our congressional campaigns have to disclose donors above a certain level. And we all do that. We want that. But since the decision in 1958, the NAACP via Alabama, we have never required donors to issue groups to be disclosed. You can understand why the NAACP brought this suit in 1958, don't you? I do. Why in the world would we then weaponize the same processes that were used in 1958 against African Americans when they were exercising, and groups like the NAACP were exercising their right to free speech? These are the concerns I have with this bill, among the many others. I look forward to working with my colleagues in a bipartisan way, if given the chance. But remember, as you mentioned, Ms. Fishbach, there was no markup. You were not able to have your voice be heard at our committee hearings because you weren't here. But let's not forget that this original bill was written with the aid of outside special interest groups at the end of the election cycle in 2018, was introduced on January 3rd of 2019 and co-sponsored by every member of the majority party. They didn't read it. They wrote it with special interest groups in the darkness. And that's something that this bill is supposed to change. I'm not convinced that the majority has learned their lesson because they took that same bill, added pages to it, but then they subtracted some provisions. I'm glad my colleague, Mr. Raskin, brought up the ethics reforms in this bill. It's interesting to know that they've actually been relaxed a little bit from the version in the last Congress to this Congress. Could that be because there's a different party in power in the White House, a different president? I don't know. I didn't get a chance to write it.
And Ranking Member Davis, if I could just follow up just a little bit regarding the top-down approach and who wrote the bill, and I understand that the majority didn't discuss the bill with the stakeholders, which would be the National Association of the Secretary of States, the National Association of State Election Directors, the National Association of Counties, and NCSL, and the gentleman that you mentioned from your hometown. But don't you, why wouldn't they talk to those folks? Because I think that some of this top-down kind of approach could have been addressed, and they would have understood better. But who did they talk to, and why wouldn't they talk to those folks that actually have to implement these policies?
I mean, I think that's a question for the majority. I'd like to know if why these groups weren't consulted. I was under the impression there was some concern on a bipartisan call with the secretaries of state and other election officials just a few days ago. Multiple secretaries of state and election officials have reached out to me. This is why our only witness in the only hearing where I got 5 minutes of questions and my two other colleagues on House admin got 5 minutes of questions for these witnesses. So 15 minutes of Republican minority questions are now going to suffice for a markup and this mammoth bill coming forward. There were many issues brought up during our hearing that even some of the Democratic witnesses at a recent hearing, they noted that multiple provisions in this bill need to be amended. Now, the drafters of this legislation, they were so sloppy in writing this bill, they utterly failed to understand the complexity of America's local government systems and our decentralized election administration system. They forgot that North Dakota doesn't even have voter registration. In Maine, elections are run by municipalities, not counties, and that multiple states have, as Colorado does, full vote by mail systems, where mandating in-person absentee voting would be a step backwards. So that's the problem with the top-down approach that many election administrators and secretaries of state have reached out to us to say, we don't want Democrats in Washington that control Congress telling us how to run our election cycle. And I'd certainly hope some of my colleagues would agree with some of their election officials.
And Madam Chair, if I might, maybe Chair Lofgren would like to address that. Why weren't those groups talked to and allowed to have input into the bill?
Well, as I'm sure Mr. Davis will recall, we did have representatives from state election officials as witnesses in the last Congress. And we, just as recently as last week, had a Secretary of State as well as a local election official as a witness. I do want to say a clarification, Mr. Davis, you probably were not aware that the provisions taken out of the ethics portion of the bill were only taken out because they have since become law, and therefore it would be redundant to put them in a bill since they were enacted into law already. And that's the only reason why they're not included. I thought it was important to clarify that.
You're on mute.
Still unmuted. I'm sorry. I was trying to reduce the extra noise. But Chair Lofgren, could you summarize the difference between the two managers' amendments for me? I understand that one version was introduced a few days ago, and there was a newer, longer version that was introduced today, and I would appreciate having a better understanding of the differences.
Yes, the manager's amendment makes several technical and conforming edits to HR 1 that's as commonly done. It includes augmenting the section on findings of general constitutional authority and clarifying the standards for judicial review. The amendment requires mail-in ballots to use the Postal Service barcode service as required in the Vote by Mail Tracking Act, introduced by Representative Carolyn Maloney, the chairperson of the Government Oversight and Government Reform Committee. It also clarifies that the definition of a thing of value in the federal election campaign prohibition on foreign donations to political campaigns and candidates includes information sought or obtained for political advantage. It strikes section 4411, which is related to the inadmissibility and deportability of aliens engaged in improper interference in U.S. elections, since that is already covered in the Immigration and Nationality Act. The amendment updates the findings, reaffirming the commitment of Congress to restore the Voting Rights Act, and it also clarifies that the redistricting reform provisions of HR 1 apply to redistricting following the 2020 decennial census and provides clear procedures for drawing maps for this truncated timeline due to the delay in the census data. Now, these updates include an amendment offered by Congressman G.K. Butterfield, the chairman of the Election Subcommittee and the House Administration Committee, which would require states to submit the final district plan approved by the state's Independent Redistricting Commission to the Department of Justice for administrative review before it could be enacted, although that review will be suspended if litigation is initiated pursuant to the statute. I hope that clarifies. We also added, a section on the governance of corporate PACs, allowing the commission to collect information to assess the governance of corporate PACs and requiring the FEC to do an analysis of donors. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I would just like to give Ranking Member Davis the opportunity to maybe respond to some of those items if he has things he'd like to address.
Yeah, the provisions regarding the ethics rules that have been relaxed and are not law are addressed in my good friend and colleague, Ranking Member Comer's amendment number 154. If the majority is willing to work with us to rule that amendment in order and support that, I'm more than willing to put that forth. And there was also mentioned earlier that some Republicans have offered amendments that Chairperson Lofgren believes would nationalize the election process. I'm not a co-sponsor of that amendment, not a co-sponsor of that bill. I am speaking as clear and concisely as I have been every single time that the House Administration Committee and the majority here in Congress have tried to nationalize our election process, that we need to stop it. And I continue to hope that we can find some common ground on ways to make our processes safer. Continue to hope that we can work together on making sure that we have systems in place, voluntary systems in place that will allow for areas that I believe are at risk when it comes to cybersecurity, like e-poll books, voter registration lists. Let's work together to make sure that those data systems are secure, just like the standards that are in place for electronic voting systems that we currently have through the Election Assistance Commission.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. I will now recognize Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm so glad to hear that Representative Davis is less interested now in nationalizing our elections, because I know he was very interested in conducting national oversight of the 5 largest Democratic counties in Pennsylvania during the last election, and also wasn't happy with our electoral college votes. But as to HR 1, I've spent the last 3 decades working to protect the right to vote and expand voter participation for all eligible voters, with civics education. So having spent so much time up close and personal, particularly in Pennsylvania, which has been a target of so many voter suppression efforts in the last year in particular, but in the last decade as well, it shows me how important HR 1 is, not to dictate to the states, but to set a floor to which they have to rise. We've seen modern voter suppression tactics, the influence of dark money to promote disinformation, gerrymandering, and other anti-democratic practices that have disenfranchised voters. And as I mentioned, in Pennsylvania, we've seen that up close. In 2011, the Republican legislature and Republican governor of Pennsylvania passed a gerrymandering of Pennsylvania, which, despite the fact that we had a large Democratic majority of registered voters, produced 18 congressional seats, of which 13 went to Republicans. In 2018, that system had to be undone. It was only undone because the courts declared that gerrymandering to be so unconstitutional that it was depriving people of their vote. Okay. In 2012, the Republican legislature and the Republican governor passed a strict voter ID law, which discriminated against voters of color, the elderly, and low-income voters. Again, the courts had to overturn that because it limited the forms of identification that were acceptable to those which were not readily acceptable to a certain class of voters who happened overwhelmingly to be Democrats. So we need, at the federal level, to make sure that those who are eligible to vote in our federal elections are in fact able to exercise that essential freedom to participate in our representative democracy. So Chairwoman Lofgren, can you talk about that interplay between our federal and our state elections and how HR 1 performs in that gap in a constitutional way?
Well, as you know, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a very important step forward for the United States in preserving the rights of especially minorities to vote and to exercise the franchise. Prior to that measure, African Americans in the South in particular were subject to poll taxes, were excluded from their rights as American citizens to vote. Those measures were very much rooted in the 14th Amendment. But the need to preserve the rights of all Americans to vote is not just it is to protect minorities in this country. And HR 4, the Voting Rights Act, to the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, will be coming before the floor later in this Congress. Mr. Butterfield, as chair of the Election Subcommittee, has outlined an aggressive schedule of hearings to do further investigation and further compilation of the statistical basis for the need of that provision. But discriminating against Americans' right to vote is not only based on ethnicity. It can be based on excessive partisanship. It can be, and which is we see rampantly going on all over the United States. Article 1, Section 4 gives Congress the right, as you say, at any time by law to make or alter the regulations. And what we're saying is, let's have a fair vote. There were voters in Georgia in the last election in November that had to wait in line for 8 hours to get into the polling booth. Do you think that everyone who had a right to vote actually got to vote? in that line because some of them had kids they had to get back to, that they were getting out of school or they had to get back to their job. There were people in other parts of the country who had to drive for 3 hours to get to a drop box to deposit a ballot. Do you think everybody who had a right to vote really was able to exercise their franchise? No. And so I say this, let's have every American cast their vote, and whatever they decide is what we live with. You know, whoever the candidate is, whoever the party is, I'm willing to trust the American people and the vote that they cast. And to say that this is partisan, that's ridiculous. It's partisan only if you think if all the people vote, your side will lose. I don't know who wins when everybody votes, but I do know this. America wins when everybody votes, and that's what HR 1 does.
Thank you. One more question for you. You know, people talk a lot about partisanship, and I know when we're all home, we hear from our constituents saying, you know, can't you all get along, and how can Congress work in a more bipartisan way? And what I read, and the experts seem to suggest, is that one of the issues is gerrymandering, because if people only are running in safe seats and they're only really, if they get to pick their own voters and these seats are preordained by party, that increases the partisanship. Can you talk about the gerrymandering aspects of, anti-gerrymandering aspects of HR 1?
Well, it requires a nonpartisan redistricting commission that is made up from people who are not politicians, who have to do the following things. First, you have to make sure that the districts comply with the US Constitution, basically one person, one vote. And then they need to implement the provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. They need to provide that racial, ethnic, and language minorities have an equal opportunity to participate in the political process, not dilute or diminish their ability to elect candidates of their choice. They have to have boundaries that minimize the division of communities of interest and shouldn't be drawn to unduly favor or disfavor any political party. You know, we've seen the situation, you know, all of us, if we're honest, know that there are elected officials in both parties that only have to cater to the fringe because everything is done in the primary, and the more extreme you are, no matter which party you're in, the easier it is politically. I don't know that that's a great thing for the United States. And I think most people, most Americans would say we're not in the best place as a country in terms of partisanship and being able to find common ground. And partisan gerrymandering is a big part of that phenomena. If we have more competitive districts, we have more capacity to reach out to all Americans, not just a few, and to find common ground to move our country forward. So a number of states have these commissions. They've had a positive impact in getting people to a better spot. And I'll say both parties, you know, if they control the legislature, both parties do gerrymandering. So, you know, and it's perverse in every case. Let's stop it. Let's have citizens pick the districts instead of the politicians picking the voters.
I think that's right. And I think it's also kind of a uniquely federal spin of HR 1 that we've seen a number of states like Arizona and California and other states move to having the Citizens Commission and being happier with the results, finding the results more accurately reflecting their population. We found the same thing in Pennsylvania, although it had to be forced by the courts because the legislature refused to do that. I am really excited about HR 1 and very happy to support it. I'm particularly proud that I have some bills in it to increase access for voters with disabilities, to bring transparency to inaugural funds, because we've seen some abuses there, to increase the use of ballot drop boxes, which were critical to getting out the vote in Pennsylvania this last time. And I'm also hopeful to have an amendment to increase early access to voting on college campuses, because we've seen some of the college campuses in my region, and I have 19, be subject to voter suppression by having polling places removed. So I'll proudly support this legislation, and with that, I would yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I don't want to repeat, but would like to associate myself with the remarks made by my colleagues, Mr. Raskin, Ms. Scanlon, yourself, Mr. Perlmutter, although I don't have an opinion, I'm sort of agnostic on the use of the word fulsome, and I know how I feel about the Broncos. But other than that, this has really been a really important conversation. I will say this, I'm not going to go on at length, but I feel, and this is with all due respect to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, but to talk about fair elections and election reform, and to talk about federal intervention after we have just witnessed over the last several months, in my view, the most serious threat to the foundations of American democracy, which is to not respect the peaceful transfer of power, to not respect that fair, free elections should matter in this country, has left, I think, my friends on the other side of the aisle in the awkward position of not supporting fair elections and then trying to somehow suggest that our efforts to continue to improve the electoral process are off base or unnecessary, particularly federal involvement. Without recounting it, but 60 lawsuits aimed at overturning an election, all deemed to be baseless. This continued claim, even by the former president this weekend, that the election was stolen, although there is zero evidence, not a single shred of evidence that there was a systemic or systematic effort, without a shred of evidence that there was any fraud that was done on a systematic way, and to continue to undermine the very foundations. I can't imagine a more serious topic. I can't imagine one, and this isn't just, respectfully, a handful of Republican members who objected to the certification. This is 2/3 of the caucus objected to it. This is something we haven't seen in the better part of 2 centuries happen in American politics. In 1800, John Adams made what I think is one of the greatest acts of patriotism in this country. He turned over the keys to the White House to Thomas Jefferson. And that's something that we have observed now for more than 2 centuries. And yet, I hate to think of what would have happened if just a few elections had gone in a different way this year. So I think this is a very, very serious thing. Are there things that could be improved in this? Are there ways we probably could, if we had good faith on both sides, come together to improve this? I don't doubt that there are. But I think the credibility now with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle is very much lacking. I think you can always come to a place of bipartisanship, and you can always improve, and you can always work things out, and you can always talk about it if you operate in good faith. And I just honestly, and it pains me because I have many, many friends on the other side of the aisle, and I obviously represent hundreds of thousands of Republicans back home. It pains me to say the leadership of the party has, in a sense, ceded all moral right to have a conversation about this issue. And until you have a significant number of Republicans acknowledge that Joe Biden is the president of the United States, won the election in a fair election process, and the idea that somehow the people in Georgia, the Republican officials in Georgia who spoke out repeatedly and took some offense at the president's language and the many Republican officials in Pennsylvania, and yet you objected to the certification. So when we talk about states' rights, that'd be fine if we actually respected those states, but we didn't do it. And in my mind, this is the single biggest threat to American democracy, as I said, since the Civil War. And until there is some indication that we're going to all respect the right of voters as the sovereign in this nation, voters, citizens, Americans are the sovereign. There's no king, there's no queen. The sovereign is the people. They spoke, and yet your party, 2/3 of the members of your caucus, and I certainly would not bring everyone into it. Some of you, in my mind, demonstrated great courage in standing for the Electoral College and the will of citizens. But until it's embraced by more members, I think any conversation about this, frankly, is, and sadly, is of little use. So with that, Mr. Chair, or Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Desaulnier. You're on mute, Mr. Desaulnier.
Thank you. I am fulsomely unmuted. Want to associate myself with all the comments except perhaps those directed at Mr. Perlmutter with affection. I also want to say that I consider both ranking members friends, a good deal of respect for them. So these comments I hope you take in that regard. And I have to say, I feel a little bit like Alice in the Wonderland again. And of course, who the Mad Hatter is based on the viewer's perception. Mr. Davis, I congratulate you. I think you've entered a new part of the political lexicon in speech czars that, from my perspective, will join death panels. But this is so important. And, you know, in the history of this country, trying to make sure that power is really in the hands of the voters has been a challenge in this country. And of course, our mythology is that it's been a great accomplishment. And unfortunately, I think we have to accept the shortcomings we've had in this country that are obvious in order to get to the point where we do have greater participation. So according to Pew, we are 24th out of 35 developed countries in voter participation. I don't exactly think that's a city on the hill type of thing that other countries are going to follow, whether you think that expression is from the Bible, Reagan, or Winthrop. So this is all at a time, and this is why I think this bill is so important. And having been part of redistricting at both the local and state level, I just think there are three things that clearly we have a conflict of interest in regards to, and that's our compensation, our districts, and campaign contributions. And I, in the 10 years since Citizens United, we've gone from $300 million, a little bit over $300 million in expenditures for IEs, independent expenditures, to almost $3 billion. So as justice, and this is the same time that our inequality has expanded to historic levels, and there's plenty of good research that's evolving that that's not an accident. The campaign contributions parallel the inequality in this country. So to Stephen's comment, particularly in the context of what we've been through in the last few months about stolen elections, we have to I just think it's in everyone's interest, and I'm sorry to bear to lecture, but having listened to this, I would agree with you, Mr. Davis. I really wish we could have an honest discussion of give and take, but for my perception, I think the give and take is not proportionate, and I'd love to have a conversation with you how we have a more dispassionate and proportionate give and take. So that I'll just conclude with where we go from here, and hope that at least we can pass this out. And I would take you up, both the ranking members, in a discussion offline about how we have a give and take that restores the integrity of our elections that Justice Stevens eloquently opined in his minority opinion with Citizens United. With that, I'll yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Ross?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I just want to say that this bill, the For the People Act, is basically about making elections fairer and ensuring that everyone can easily and conveniently cast their ballot. And we've had a lot of experience with several of these provisions in North Carolina over the last 20 years. But I want to talk a little bit about what happened in this last election during the pandemic and what many of these reforms did to make voting safer and fairer. So in 2020, North Carolina had the longest voting period in the entire country. The state began mailing ballots to voters 60 days before the election. Now, the history of our mail-in ballots came from the fact that we're a military state, and we wanted to give members of the military long enough time to participate. But we now do that for all voters. But after the mail-in voting period started, we had 19 days of early voting, and we had same-day voter registration allowed at every early voting location. When I was in the state legislature, that was my bill. I got that through. There was a lot of brouhaha about it, and it ended up being something that the elections officials liked because they could clear up people's addresses. If somebody went to the wrong place to vote, they could get that fixed. They could do all these different things and have those ballots cast before election day, so that on election day, it was easier to administer the votes. So that was very popular among election officials. But North Carolina made other reforms to make it easier and safer to vote during the pandemic, including in creating an online absentee ballot request system. Because of all of these options in North Carolina, we saw a record turnout in 2020 with 75% of voters casting ballots, the vast majority before Election Day, which made Election Day during a pandemic much safer to administer. Now, voting reform, as we've seen today, is a deeply partisan topic. And there's a narrative that when it's easier to vote, then more people vote that the Democrats win. Well, I'm here to tell you that's not always true, and it certainly wasn't true in North Carolina in 2020. In North Carolina, we saw in 2008 that Barack Obama used many of these voting options in order to win in North Carolina. But in 2020, Donald Trump solidly won North Carolina. In 2020, our Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a Democrat, lost her seat to one of her colleagues on the court by 400 votes. What we have seen in North Carolina is that whoever uses these tools and motivates the voters will win the election. And in 2020, there were not complaints about the administration of the election. We had record turnout, and in the main, the Republicans did better using these tools. Any party or candidate can use the measures in this bill, in the For the People Act, to turn out voters. Again, we saw Barack Obama do it masterfully in North Carolina, and we saw Donald Trump do it masterfully in North Carolina. Making it easier to vote is about the people. It's about the public. It's not about us as elected officials. And we should all be able to support measures that make it easy, convenient, and in 2020, clearly safer to vote. And that's why I support this bill. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Ross. Does any other member of the committee wish to ask a question? Okay, seeing none, I would like to thank our witnesses for their testimony and their patience. You are now excused. I'd like to inform the committee that we will hear from any members wishing to testify on amendments to HR 1 at the end of today's hearing. And now I'd like to welcome our witnesses to provide testimony on HR 1280, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. Representative Jackson Lee, Representative Biggs.
What do I do with that?
We're delighted that you are here. Waiting for them to come on.
Okay, I just want to make sure it's charging. What?
Am I on? I'm not on.
And then
I don't see me.
Sheila, we can hear you. We can't see you.
yes, so
We're working on it.
without objection, any written materials you submit to rules
Do you see it?
documents at mail.house.gov before the conclusion of this meeting will be entered into the record. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Texas, Representative Jackson Lee.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all of the Rules Committee members, to the ranking member, Mr. Cole, for your extensive courtesy that you give to members to allow them to come before you to explain very important legislation. This is a significant moment in history, and I'm delighted to be here to present the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that was founded, grounded in the tragedy of police violence against our citizens, and as well the enormous tragedy and death of George Floyd. Yet I think it is extremely important to emphasize that this legislation accepts the good service of our law enforcement throughout the nation, their commitment to protect and serve, and that this is to attempt to actually enhance and improve policing across America, which now counts 18,000 different police departments. The tragic death of George Floyd has awakened this nation and the world to the gross injustice that too many African Americans face on a daily basis. In addition, it's important to acknowledge and thank the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, my friend and colleague, Karen Bass, and her collaborative work, along with the Congressional Black Caucus, our new chair, Joyce Beatty, the members of the Judiciary Committee who worked extensively in a very long markup in 2020. And I'm delighted to be here with my ranking member, Mr. Biggs. It is not a new story, but the sad truth is that when people told their stories of police abuse, of murder at the hands of bad police officers, they simply weren't believed. It has taken technology and active citizen involvement to document and expose this ugly reality in our country. Despite protests sparked by the killing of George Floyd and others, police killed 1,127 people in 2020, more than 2019, but consistent with the rates in previous years. That number includes 645 killings since Floyd's death, which also includes the tragic death of Angelo Quinto, which is so shockingly reminiscent of Floyd's own death at the hands of Antioch, California police officers recently. That is where we are. Police have subjected countless more, most frequently Black, Latinx, and Indigenous people, people living in poverty, and people with disabilities, to other abuses through much more common daily interactions that are coercive and often violent, even if they do not result in death. These abuses have contributed to high rates of arrest and mass incarceration, with devastating long-term consequences for these and other communities. But even when incidents of excessive force or even death at the hands of law enforcement have been on display for the world to see, time and again, Congress has failed to deliver this sort of meaningful change that is necessary to meet the moment and to promote good policing across America. Last summer, in response to the call for action from righteous protesters across our nation, the House sent an historic bipartisan message that the time has come for bold reform on policing practices in America. This week, we have the opportunity to pick up where we left off and once again, send to the other chamber legislation worthy of signature by our new president. It is very important to take note of the pain that some of these incidences, in fact, all of these incidences, violent incidences have generated. And it has generated from east to west and north to south. And it has really impacted people of many different backgrounds. But let me for a moment say to you that I know the Floyd family. Many of them grew up, including George Floyd, in my congressional district. We knew of their mother who nurtured other children who were not able to find loving homes. They lived in public housing, but they're raised with loving and nurturing commitment by their family. Big Floyd was an umbrella of love to the younger kids on the block. This family never expected to be thrown into the international spotlight. And what have they done with it? They have been caring and nurturing themselves. They have stood alongside of police officers. They've marched with them, and they have mourned with those who have been injured or lost their lives. What an amazing family. And they've established a foundation where they want to engage the American public on how to work with policing, how to help train police to be able to work better with our community. That's the Floyd family. While there is no single policy prescription that will erase the decades of systemic racism and excessive policing, this bill will finally hold police officers' misconduct accountable for their work, or their deeds rather, and separate them from the majority of those endowed with the ethic of just and equitable public safety. Remember, to protect and serve. That is why we were proud to introduce the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which reimagines policing for the 21st century, creates the highest standards for the profession, and holds those officers accountable who fail to uphold the ethic of protecting and serving their communities. We've worked very hard on this. It's been a collaborative work, yes, with Republicans and Democrats working together. This bold, transformative legislation effectively bans chokeholds, prohibits racial and religious profiling, ends no-knock warrants in drug cases, stops the militarization of law enforcement, and requires the use of body cameras. Isn't that interesting? In 2021, that is still not widely utilized. It also collects data on the use of force and creates a national registry of police misconduct to ensure that officers who are unfit to serve are not able to move from department to department. It is crucial that we recognize that we can be a nation of laws, police officers, working with communities, relationships, reimagining. That is what the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act represents. Now, I know that the change is difficult, but I'm certain that police officers who risk their lives every day are concerned about their profession. I speak to them every day, and they don't want to work in an environment where they're chastised for intervening when they see a fellow officer abuse a citizen or use deadly force when it is not necessary. And I'm certain that police officers want to make sure they're trained in the best practices in policing. We in the Congress should want that as well. To help support officers, this legislation will create the first ever national accreditation standards for the operation of police departments, set national standards for officer conduct, and establish best practices in training, hiring, de-escalation strategies, and bystander duty. These are the issues that 18,000 police departments face in the United States. And they are looking to have a training regimen and protocols that they can engage with the community themselves safely. And as they all say, they can go home to their family and communities can go home to theirs. But despite our best intentions, there will be some officers who cross the line. That is why the bill also includes strong accountability measures, both as a matter of simple justice to keep unfit officers off the street. A profession where you have the power to kill should be a profession that requires highly trained officers who are accountable to the public. This is what this bill accomplishes. We all want to be safe in our communities. We all want the police to come to our rescue when we're in trouble. We all want to support the brave men and women who put their lives on the line every day for us. And when we interact with the police, we all want to be treated with respect, not suspicion. Nobody should be subjected to harassment or excessive force just because of the color of their skin. Nobody should suffer the indignities of racial profiling or be on the receiving end of a deadly chokehold. All Americans should want that for themselves, their children, and their neighbors. But too often today, that is not a reality lived by African Americans. Last summer, in the midst of a global pandemic, the world witnessed the birth of a new movement in our country, with thousands marching to register their horror at hearing the cry, "I can't breathe." Interestingly enough, we saw law enforcement throughout the nation march with these mostly peaceful protesters, Black Lives Matter and others. People march to demand not just change, but transformative change. Change that ends police brutality, that ends racial profiling, that ends or raises the standards of the profession, and that holds accountable officers who fail to meet those standards. The voices we have heard on the streets and in district Zoom calls from our constituents are demanding meaningful and substantive change, not a fig leaf. They will not accept reform light, and neither should this Congress. That is why we must continue to support the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. If this legislation had been law of the land several years ago, Eric Garner and George Floyd would be alive today because the bill bans chokeholds. If the bill had been law last year, Breonna Taylor would not have been shot to death in her sleep because no-knock warrant for drug offenses would have been illegal. If a national registry had been in effect, it would have revealed that the officer who killed 12-year-old Tamir Rice had been fired from another department and had a propensity for violence. He never would have had the opportunity to be rehired by another department, and Tamir Rice would be alive to explore his potential as a recent high school graduate. If the bill had been in effect, Sandra Bland and Danny Ray Thomas and Pamela Turner would have been alive today because there would have been extensive training provisions that would have provided training and teaching against excessive force and teaching to provide the end or make illegal racial profiling and to teach how to de-escalate. We now have a real opportunity with this legislation to reimagine public safety so that it is just and equitable for all Americans. That is what our country is about, equality for all. I urge at this moment in history, this significant moment in history, I urge all of my colleagues to once again seize this opportunity and support the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, just as we did with bipartisan support just a few months ago. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I would certainly be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you,
Madam,
Ms. Lee.
yield
I now recognize the gentleman from Arizona, Representative Biggs.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. And I also thank the ranking member, Cole, members of the committee. I appreciate you having me here today to discuss HR 1280, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act of 2021. And I'm grateful to be here with the Judiciary Subcommittee Chair, Ms. Jackson Lee. Every human life has value and importance, and George Floyd's life was no exception. The death of Mr. Floyd was a tragedy and has sparked a national movement. David Dorn was a retired St. Louis police captain who was killed during the violence that occurred after George Floyd's death in Minneapolis. And Captain Dorn's life also of value and with great importance. His death also was a tragedy. And while Americans are demanding action and President Biden is calling for unity, Speaker Pelosi and Chairman Nadler have chosen to go their own way to ignore the voices and reject the ideas of nearly half of the House of Representatives. Rather than seeking to unify our nation, my colleagues across the aisle are continuing to shut out Republicans every step of the way. Last year, President Trump signed an important executive order that encouraged law enforcement agencies to implement best practices, provide for department and officer accountability, and prioritize training for responding to incidents involving the mentally ill, addicted, and homeless. To be clear, there are some issues addressed in HR 1280 on which Republicans agree with our Democrat colleagues. But as drafted, the bill has serious flaws that would unnecessarily encumber the men and women who serve and protect our communities, and that will make us all less safe. And because of these flaws, I oppose this bill in its current form. For instance, this legislation would lower the mens rea standard when charging an officer with criminal misconduct from willfulness to knowingly or recklessly. In order to be convicted under current law, an officer must specifically intend to deprive a person of a federal right made definite by decision or other rule of law. By lowering the standard to knowingly or recklessly, an officer could be convicted without having any specific intent to deprive a person of that federal right. Police officers are frequently required to make split-second decisions under incredible stress. In those situations, hesitation can be deadly for the officers or others in the general public. Likewise, removing qualified immunity could result in an ineffectual police force and leave our communities vulnerable to crime. The Supreme Court has noted that qualified immunity gives government officials breathing room to make reasonable, mistaken judgments about open legal questions. And without that room, officers will hesitate to act, and that hesitation, again, could be costly. On this issue, I believe there's room to find common ground, but my colleagues across the aisle have approached this legislation in a short-sighted manner. According to media reports, some members of the Democrat caucus share these concerns. For instance, last year, I introduced an amendment regarding de-escalation training programs that would help ratchet down situations of heightened tensions. One Arizona company that developed such a high-level training program has had great success. The program's use is expanding throughout the country. I have actually taken a component of that training program, and I tell you, it is incredibly effective. Nationwide, my amendment would have been a nationwide requirement of de-escalation training with specific training modalities. That was rejected. This bill also seeks to severely limit the Department of Defense's 1033 program, which allows law enforcement agencies at all levels of government to receive surplus equipment from DoD. Police departments in my own district have used the program to acquire necessary equipment that includes night vision goggles, reflex sights, and infrared illuminators. One rural county just south and east of mine that's nearly the same size as the state of Connecticut and spends a great deal of time combating drug trafficking and illegal immigration was able to acquire a helicopter to aid in their response efforts. And that equipment protects law enforcement officers and the communities they serve during dangerous situations. And that equipment is also used to rescue victims in emergency situations such as natural disasters, or quite frankly, those who are coming into the country illegally and facing the incredible heat of our summers and would perish otherwise without the ability of that helicopter to go and provide rescue. We saw this also during Hurricane Harvey. During the Judiciary Committee's markup of H.R. 7120 last Congress, Republicans offered a dozen amendments to address these issues and other flaws in the bill. These amendments would have improved police accountability, strengthened the penalties for lynching, and ensured adequate border security. Chairman Nadler and the Democrats declined to accept a single Republican amendment. We were told that our proposed changes to the bill would be considered before it heads to the floor. But, Mr. Chairman, you know that they were not. Nearly 9 months later, Republican proposals still have not been seriously considered. This bill is exactly the same as it passed the House last June. The Democrat majority has done nothing to work with us on improving this legislation. This Congress, with 60 new members in the House and 11 new members of the Judiciary Committee, we haven't even had a hearing or markup on this legislation. Our new committee members on both sides of the aisle have valuable perspectives, and I'm sure they could have offered amendments that would make this bill better. But the Democrat majority intends to pass this bill out of the House less than a week after it was introduced this year, with no committee hearing or markup. In closing, Mr. Chairman, this bill does nothing to stop the dangerous and irresponsible calls to defund, dismantle, and disband our police. The idea of defunding and dismantling our police forces is one of the most absurd ideas I've heard in politics. We should be clear as a body that while we support reforms to police accountability and transparency, we do not support eliminating law enforcement altogether. And I would call on all members of Congress to resonate that important message. Mr. Chairman and members of the Rules Committee, you have before you the opportunity to do what Chairman Nadler has refused to do. You have the power to make this a truly bipartisan bill to help President Biden's calls to unify the country come to fruition. I urge you to adopt an open rule and allow all of our colleagues, both Democrat and Republican, to offer their ideas for inclusion in this important piece of legislation. Again, thank you for letting me take a few minutes of your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you both for your testimony. And before I turn to our members for their questions, I would like to highlight a bill that I recently introduced. the White Supremacy in Law Enforcement Information Act. I hope it is clear to everyone in this hearing that structural racism and implicit bias have led to the deaths of way too many men and women of color at the hands of police. Last Congress, I led a letter with 27 members asking for the FBI to release an internal intelligence assessment entitled White Supremacist Infiltration of Law Enforcement from 2006. That was the last report of its kind that we know of. Soon after, the Committee on Oversight and Reform was able to obtain an unredacted version. However, this 15-year-old report raised more questions than answers. For this reason, I introduced H.R. 1031, White Supremacy and Law Enforcement Information Act, which will lay the groundwork to confront white supremacy in law enforcement. Specifically, the bill would require the FBI and the DOJ to release intelligence assessments of white supremacy infiltration and links to law enforcement since 2006, detail what actions they have taken to address this issue, and provide an updated assessment. Information is what I'm asking for. Congresswoman Jackson Lee, I hope that I can count on you to bring the bill up for a hearing in your subcommittee and bring it to the House floor.
Madam Chair, if I might, thank you very much for a very astute and narrowly defined legislation. We are concerned in the Judiciary Committee on the issues of white racism and the impact on people of color. Just last week, as chair of that committee, we held a hearing on the rise of domestic terrorism in America, and we will look forward to receiving your legislation and as well giving it the attention that it deserves. And thank you for your leadership on this issue.
Thank you. I will now turn to Mr. Cole for any questions that he may have.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Just a couple of points and then just a couple of questions. I mean, this last year was one of the more disappointing episodes to me legislatively, because I thought there was a lot of common ground where we could have moved ahead. You know, I talked a lot to my police chiefs, since I'm sure everybody on this panel did, both our witnesses. By the way, thank you for both our witnesses. They're two members I really think very highly of. And I found they were all for more training. They thought a registry would be a good idea. Most of them had already banned deadly chokeholds. They thought, you know, didn't have any problem, thought we could reach common ground there. They certainly thought body cameras would be important, and particularly my smaller police departments that don't have a lot in the way of resources, it would have made a big difference. They would be happy to do it. They just needed the additional funds. And so I looked at that and I thought, well, I know we don't agree on everything. I think the biggest concerns were the liability issues where officers were concerned, and that was, I mean, the individual officers were worried about frivolous lawsuits. The chiefs were worried about the problems of recruiting officers if they were too subject to harassment. So I thought that was ground that we could probably have worked through. And I think Senator Scott in particular probably came closer, you know, in the Senate to getting that done. I think a very generous offer of amendments and working, and but it didn't happen. And I think it was largely because it was a political issue, and a lot of folks didn't want to solve it. They wanted to politicize it, and maybe they just believe that's strongly in their positions. I respect that. That's certainly something we all find ourselves on occasion from time to time. But regardless, we missed the opportunity. I'm sorry this year that we did not do, as my friend from Arizona suggested, a markup. I mean, it really needed not to bring the same product out. I'll make a prediction now. It will pass the House floor, but probably by a reduced margin compared to last year. And if there's not going to be much give and take, there won't be much change here. And so I send it over to the Senate in the hope that maybe they'll get serious about addressing it and they actually can find the common ground that I think we've missed an opportunity to find in the House. Because again, I agree with Mr. Biggs. I think there's a lot of common ground here and a real desire to do something legislatively. So having said that, my first question is to my good friend from Texas, the gentlelady from Texas. If the Senate fails to pass a bill this month or next month, are you willing to either sit down and work on a new package, a more bipartisan package than we've got here in the House, or would you be willing to consider if the Senate does come up with a bipartisan package and sends it back to us, something like that?
Mr. Cole, let me thank you very much for your continuing leadership on the Rules Committee. I think we've seen each other quite a bit over the few years.
Over many years.
few years that we young people have been able to serve. I do want to just give you a little bit of history very quickly and then answer your question. And that is that you may not be aware that the Judiciary Committee, and Mr. Biggs knows, he is right, we do have new members, but we had an 11-hour hearing. I was just looking at the count of our witnesses, and I think they were somewhere between 14 or 15. I'll find the count here in a minute. And we sat through all of that, Republicans and Democrats. And then, of course, we had a 7-hour, we had a 7-hour hearing, an 11-hour markup. And of course, there was a lot of give and take, a lot of Republican engaged, and had an opportunity to be involved in this as well. We have an incredibly important moment. I indicated to you that we had a Mr. Quinto who died by a chokehold, if you will, 2 days before Christmas, and his family called because he was in a stressful, traumatic condition that did not call for his life to be lost. But he too had officers to sit on his body. No one tried to de-escalate. No one intervened. And so we're at a crisis moment. But what I would say to you, without predicting what the Senate would do, I do believe that we would have an opportunity to conference. We're willing to do that. And in the conference, it might be long, that we have the opportunity for both houses, which of course, as you well know, there will be Republican members there. The Senate has its own needs for collegiality in its present configuration. And I think we will have the opportunity to move forward. But we think it is so urgent that it is important for us to take this moment to move it on to the Senate, because we've laid the groundwork for an extensive 7 hours of markup, 7 hours of hearing. I keep getting an 11 hours of a markup. We think we have laid sufficient predicate for moving it forward. And as you well know, the rules of the House, and you were on record saying you didn't agree with them, but it allows you to move legislation that is of such significance and of such a moment before April 1st, if you've had a markup in the last Congress, and we have had both a markup and a hearing. But we will be very happy to be part of a conference, and I don't think we'd put any limits on that conference. We want to get this bill to the president's desk.
Well, I appreciate my friend's words, and I take considerable comfort in what she has to say, because I don't think this vehicle, frankly, could pass the Senate as is with the filibuster rules that they have. And I think it's going to have to change. And, I didn't enjoy voting against it last time, but I couldn't in good conscience, having talked to almost every police department in my district, ignore their concerns. And yet they were willing to, and again, express support for a number of these items that are in here: the registry, the chokeholds, the training, the cameras. In other words, they thought a lot of this was more than acceptable, was desirable and good. So I'll approach it the same way this time. I do want to ask one question to you, Mr. Biggs. I think sometimes there's a sense, and I think this bill hopefully unintentionally creates the illusion that we're not interested in doing anything. If you happen to be a Republican, vote against it on police reform. I think a lot of our members are very interested in getting involved in police reform because the incident, as my friend from Texas said with Mr. Floyd, is not uncommon. We've had too many instances like that, and it was horrific. There's just no justification for it whatsoever. And we had a number of others around that time, so it certainly didn't declare in isolation. So again, I think there is a genuine desire to do things. What are some of the things you think the two sides, the two parties could agree on that would be substantial reform, or some of the ideas that Republicans advanced that you think Democrats could look at and say, hey, that's a pretty good idea too? So.
Thanks for the question, Mr. Cole. And I took a list of some of the amendments.
Ms. Jackson Lee, you are muted.
Sorry, get one.
Oh, I apologize. Mr. Biggs, you are muted.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Cole. I appreciate the question. And I took a list of the amendments that we offered last time, and then I tried to distill some of those that I thought that there might be some mutual approbation for those. But even though the length of the hearing was long and the markup was long, the solution was baked, and there was not a willingness to really entertain. Although I think to his credit, Chairman Mathers had mentioned a couple of weeks that he thought they had some potential. So one of them, for instance, might be this. Mr. Armstrong offered an amendment to require audio recording of interviews by federal law enforcement agencies, which we don't have now. And that's that would be something that we all were in agreement. We felt everybody should be in agreement with that. There was additional penalties regarding lynching, that anti-lynching provisions that Mr. Gilmer offered. There was considerable concern about the qualified immunity, and we felt like we might need to work through that. We could work with that. It would be helpful if we did work through that. And then there was a series of other amendments that dealt with some of these issues, including the one I mentioned. There's a provision in here regarding de-escalation training. But my amendment actually provided some very specific modalities which have been shown to work, and that we should probably advance on that. So there's a whole bunch of those. I mean, and then just some of the language that's actually in this bill, I think it could be tightened up considerably. And we didn't offer amendments because we could see that the writing was on the wall. We're not going to make any changes. If we could, you know, I won't go through the list, but I have a number of these items here that I think are really, you know, we could attach to at some point in a bipartisan way. So with that, yield back to you.
Well, thank you for the answer and response. And just quickly, again, I think we missed an opportunity here because we didn't legislate this session. Again, I understand my friend from Texas' point that the urgency is there, and I actually agree with that. I think there is a lot of urgency. I think there was a lot of urgency last year. I think we could have reached a deal, and we didn't. So I take my friend from Texas seriously. This will probably pass. It will probably pass with a reduced margin. I think to get anywhere in the Senate, particularly this issue of qualified immunity that my friend from Arizona mentioned is a big one. There's going to have to be some give and take. So hopefully we'll have a productive conference, and then we can go from there. The Senate will be more deliberative this year than it chose to be last year, because I really would like to get something done legislatively on this. And I do think there's considerable overlap between the two sides on this issue, where we could get a really significant piece of legislation through that would improve what the situation that my friend from Texas laid out is just simply not acceptable in this country. So, and with that, Madam Chair, I will yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Cole. Mr. Perlmutter.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Mr. Biggs, if we were to allow your amendment on de-escalation, will you vote for this bill?
not until we, thanks for the question, Mr. Perlmutter, not until we've had a chance to go and deal with some of the other issues that I think are important, and not the least of which is the language with regard to qualified immunity. I think that's critical. And I think also that there's some other areas.
If we modified the bill to change the qualified immunity and we added your amendment on de-escalation, would you vote for the bill?
Now you're cooking with grease, Mr. Perlmutter, and we can start getting closer. I think that maybe tightening up some other language that would be appropriate. Because there's some of it is just maybe technical in nature. Others of it needs tighter definitions because some of the things are too broad.
All right, I take that as a maybe.
That's fair enough, Mr. Perlmutter.
One thing, Mr. Biggs, you and I are friends, but I have to be a scold because I just bothers me to the nth degree. I am your Democratic friend. I am your Democratic colleague. We have the Democratic majority. We are the Democratic Party. And to the degree I keep hearing Democrat majority, Democrat this, I will begin to call you and others banana Republicans because it's just, disparaging to not describe us properly. And that's my scold for the day. The other thing I wanted to say is the riot, the attack that occurred on January 6th. Mr. Raskin in the impeachment trial put together a 13 minutes of white supremacists, Trump supporters, beating, spraying, and in one instance, at least, killing police officers, our Capitol police officers. And I am so angry about that. I don't know what to say. And I just, as there's been complaints that this bill defunds police, which it does not. And the bill that we just passed, the American Rescue Plan, in fact, funds police to a substantial degree across the country. But the pictures of that Trump crowd beating our police has given me nightmares, quite frankly. And that anger makes it hard sometimes to negotiate and compromise these kinds of things. We had a similar discussion just now on HR 1. And so I do want to sit down. I do hope we can reach compromise through the conference, as Mr. Cole has suggested. But I got to tell you, those white supremacists beating our police will always stick in my mind. With that, I yield back to the chair.
Mr. Perlmutter, excuse me, Mr. Perlmutter.
Yes, Ms. Jackson.
May I kindly respond to some of the eloquence of your statement? Let me just try to frame very quickly responses that have now been given by my colleagues, both Mr. Cole and Mr. Biggs. First of all, let us look down memory lane very briefly. Donald Trump never put his executive order, which is a Republicans say they supported it, never put it into effect. Scott's Justice Act does not even embrace the executive order. The 1033 program, jurisdiction is by the Judiciary Committee and the Armed Services Committee, still allows equipment. And you can be very assured that if there is a necessity to protect communities through the 1033 program, those assets will be given. This narrows it and makes it relevant to the particular circumstances that officers would want to use military equipment against civilians. I think that's an important point. And then I want to say that we really do have bipartisan support because the Cato Institute, the Cook Foundation, ACLU, and NAACP support our qualified immunity language. let us be very clear, that is language dealing civilly. That deals with the 1983 Civil Rights Statute, which was in the around Reconstruction. And it was created, the qualified immunity was created by the Supreme Court that made the point that if you couldn't find an appellate case that was related to the facts that the police officer was involved in, you could be brutally, unfortunately, violently murdered or injured, then your qualified amendment went out, immunity, your opportunity as a plaintiff went out the courthouse door. This is to give an opportunity for the plaintiff to be in the courthouse and to present their case, and not to give absolute protection to an officer that is engaged in violent or misconduct behavior that winds up resulting in the death of one of our fellow Americans. So it is a fair due process that we have implemented, and we have the support of conservative institutes that believe that it is defensible and it is realistic, and it does not harm the rights of police officers in these civil cases, because this is for civil cases and the violation of the constitutional rights of an American citizen. So again, we had an extensive review of this during our 11-hour markup, and we certainly are open as we go forward, but we think this bill captures both the moment and is legally sound and is also sound as it relates to policy. And thank you, Mr. Perlmutter, for yielding.
Thanks, Ms. Jackson Lee, and I yield back.
Madam Chair, may I respond to Mr. Perlmutter's comments?
Sure.
Thanks. Thank you, Madam Chair and Mr. Perlmutter. I want to just let you know, Mr. Perlmutter, we are friends, and I will tell you, I also was angry about what happened on January 6th. I continue to be angry. I really believe that the people that came in here and breached the Capitol, not only did their conduct was a criminal, but it set back, in my opinion, the movement that I've been working so hard at for so many years. I think it really harmed us in a way that's been very difficult to recover from, and I hope we can recover. My hope is that we can recover. But when you say it makes it hard to negotiate and compromise, I get that. But I am telling you that I believe that the members of Congress should be and can be able to overcome their differences, particularly because I don't know anybody that doesn't feel angry and upset about what happened on January 6th. I think it's time that we can move together and see if we can overcome this. I've had people refuse to get onto my bills who've always gotten on my bills in the past because they won't work with Republicans anymore, they've told me. This is really not the way to get things done, Mr. Perlmutter, and I think you and I both know that. And so I'm hoping that we can all set this aside, and not that you set it aside and forget, but that we move forward in a more collaborative process. And I thank the gentleman for yielding to me, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you, and I hope you're right, and I yield back.
Thank you. I will now recognize Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Mrs. Jackson Lee, I just have to say, I don't have any questions for you right now, but I'd be remiss if I didn't say it publicly. I truly enjoy working with you. I don't always agree with you, as everybody knows, but you've always been incredibly nice to me, even when I was here, before I was elected, visiting the Capitol. You didn't know me from Adam. You were nice to me then. You've been nice to me ever since. So I truly enjoy your passion. I enjoy working with you, although we don't always agree. Chairman Biggs, Ranking Member Biggs, excuse me. As you know, I'm a big believer in community policing. By the way, somebody is not unmuted. I don't know. Sorry. Okay, thanks. As you know, I'm a big believer in community policing. I was a district judge, magisterial district judge, was a defense attorney, was a prosecutor in the Navy. I really think that if we have community policing, it's good. And that starts with school resource officers and works its way up a discussion for another time on school resource officers. But do you think that this bill does enough to foster community policing and get the police engaged with their communities?
Mr. Biggs, unmute.
Thank you. Thanks for the question, Mr. Riefenfelder. I don't think it's emphasized in this bill. I think community policing is an answer to a lot of the problems that in the larger communities that I'm in, and also in the small rural communities of our district. When you have police officers more engaged and you have the policing from whether it's school resources or working in the community, it seems to ameliorate a lot of the hostility that might naturally occur between the police and the community. So I think that this bill doesn't really get at that. There's nothing in it that really just kind of sticks out in my mind and says, oh, yes, they're really trying to resolve that. And so I think that's perhaps a deficiency of the bill.
So would it be fair to paraphrase what you're saying is that we need police to get out of their cars and to engage in the community, and what this bill does is actually incentivizes the police to unfortunately stay in their cars? Is that a fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair because, and I'll tell you why that's the incentive is because once you start removing liability protection, you're going to have people making decisions not to engage because there's exposure, and that exposure is not just limited anymore to their professional life. It inures to their family and their personal life, and when that happens, people respond to incentives, and they will stay away.
And then, Ranking Member Biggs, in your opinion, does this bill make our communities more safe or less safe?
I think we're going to have some problems. It's going to be a mixed bag, but I think in many respects it's going to make it less safe because what's going to happen is I see police officers are going to be moving away. They're going to away from the communities. They're going to be making decisions for their personal safety, their family safety, which is different than they are now. They have an inherent desire to be helpful in the community. That's what they want to do. But when you expose them to greater liability and you put handcuffs on them in these ways, I think they're going to be very, very scary about getting involved. And I'll just tell you that the other thing that's happening is you're seeing very, very difficult for officers to be retained right now. And so they don't want to stay, they're concerned. They're leaving places that they feel that are troublesome. They're either leaving the profession altogether, or they're going to places that they feel where the community is more supportive of law enforcement. So that makes, in my opinion, many communities to be less safe.
Thank you, Ranking Member Biggs. I appreciate it. And with that, I would yield.
Would the gentleman from Pennsylvania just allow me a moment, please?
Oh, absolutely, Mrs. Jackson.
Let me share my kind thoughts to you, and we miss you, of course, on judiciary. I think it's important to, there are some things that have just, I think, need to be reframed. First of all, you know, we worked on the custodial recording. I want Mr. Biggs to know that that work is still going on. I think it's important to note that in addition to that work, we are also continuing, if you will, to work on the de-escalation is very much a part of this bill. But the other point that I want to make is, again, we have organizations like the Cook Foundation, the Cato Institute, that have really negated the point that this is chasing officers away. Again, this is a two-way street, and no one wants to have a empty, hollow response when they're in an emergency or they need the assistance of those who are dedicated to protect and serve. There's a great deal of respect, as I've seen growing up and even now, in our communities of color for police. Our family members are police officers, but we must have respect for Black Lives Matter and also those who have felt the pain. These families, I've read the roll call of these mothers called Mothers of the Movement, whose children were lost because of bad policing. What the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act does is it lays out a roadmap ending racial profiling and religious profiling, the banning of the chokeholds, all of the people that would have lived if that had not happened. The military equipment still exists, but not to use against civilians unnecessarily or excessively. And what it does is the civil aspect of qualified immunity holds police officers accountable for bad acting, but it also, under the Cato explanation, deals with some of the case law on objectively unreasonable behavior. So there are standards, and both the plaintiff and the officer has the opportunity to be in court. Under the present context of qualified immunity, the plaintiffs don't even get into court. One case in particular that most of you have not heard of, my constituent, Robbie Tolan, a rising baseball player, his father, a pro ball player in the MLB. And he was tracked, racially profiled in a white community where his family lived because, or we call it an integrated community, but mostly white, driving in a van or a SUV that was probably of a higher cost. And an officer tracked him and put the wrong license plate in the report to the station and indicated that the young man had stolen this vehicle, tracked him or followed him all the way to his home. His parents came out and said, "This is our son, this is his home, this is his vehicle." This poor young man was on the ground, spread eagle, and his parents, as I said, were out. And the officer alleged pushed them up against the garage, and the young man lifted himself up and he was shot in the back, nearly paralyzed. He lived, but there were several things wrapped in that: excessive force, racially profiling, a Black man driving a vehicle of a certain amount of money. And they did everything, mortgaged everything for him to have a defense. And the federal court threw his case out because of qualified immunity. It went back, it went all the way to the Supreme Court, forgive me for this story, and it came back to the district court to get a new trial, and they threw it out again on qualified immunity. So I think that we can find common ground, but you need to do more research to understand that qualified immunity deals with a civil aspect of constitutional rights under Section 1983, and it does not, under the bill that we've written, deprive an officer of his or her right to be in court and to make their case, but it does give the ability for a plaintiff to finally get their day in court and not to be immediately ruled out because they can't find an appellate case that has the exact same facts of their case. It's really important to us, and it's a passionate part of this bill that many people are concerned about fairness. I think our officers, by and large, across this nation are fair and just individuals. Once we get a protocol for dealing with the community, we'll see a cooperative spirit, both between community and police, is what we all want. I yield back, and I thank the gentleman for his courtesies, and I've enjoyed working with him as well. I thank him for his courtesies.
Thank you, and likewise. And with that, I would yield back my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Raskin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to just salute Sheila Jackson-Lee for her magnificent leadership on this legislation, which has so many critical features like banning the use of chokeholds and carotid holds in the police departments, the articulation of the use of deadly force only as a last resort to repel deadly force, which is the common sense principle that really needs to obtain in a free society, the use of body cams and dashboard cameras. So I think it's long overdue, and it's a very important piece of legislation, and I want to thank her. I wanted to go back to the conversation that was taking place between Mr. Biggs and Mr. Perlmutter, which I thought was so interesting and edifying in terms of how we're going to get to common ground on reform of policing and criminal justice. And Mr. Perlmutter, expressed his consternation and his pain about what had taken place in terms of the violent insurrectionary riot on January the 6th. I heard Mr. Biggs to say that, he understood why our colleague was angry and upset. And he said he didn't know anyone who wasn't angry or upset about it. And he shared those feelings because it had set back the movement that he's been working part of. But I want to say that the problem for a lot of us is that the person who was singly most responsible for inciting those events, Donald Trump, has never stated that he was angry or upset about what took place. On the contrary, he tweeted out at 6:01 p.m. on January 6th, the end of the day, "We love you, you're very special," to the people who committed those violent acts against American democracy, against the Republic, against the House of Representatives, against the Senate. I say that because, we did give Donald Trump the opportunity to come and testify in the Senate, and he refused to do so. He refused to clarify how he felt, which I think was not only a betrayal of his country and his oath of office, but a betrayal of the people that he sent into battle, daring them to be strong and not to show weakness, but to show strength. And he couldn't even show up to say whether or not he still agreed with the people that he sent into battle. So I agree with Lindsey Graham, who said they could have had a bomb. We all could have died. Those people got into our buildings without going through security. They got into our buildings without any kind of background check. A lot of them were armed. And we know that 5 people died that day. We lost 2 other officers afterwards. But I am cheered that, Mr. Biggs is striking a different tone today. And I appreciate that. I hope, and then, maybe I'd ask you, Mr. Biggs, I don't want to press my luck in terms of finding too much common ground, but I hope this is there too. Would you agree also that it was not Antifa that waged an attack on us, that this was the mob, as Congresswoman Cheney said, that was summoned by Donald Trump and assembled by Donald Trump and sent into battle by Donald Trump, and it was not Antifa? And there's a front page article in the New York Times today talking about how that lie got started. But would you agree that it was not Antifa that waged this attack on us? That's for Mr. Biggs.
Mr. Biggs, you need to unmute, sir.
Thank you. I'm always fascinated that how you want to relitigate this thing again and again and again. Look, we know that there were people who supported Donald Trump in that group. We know that there were rabble rousers of some kind. I have read the New York Times piece that you're referring to. I'm not sure I accept all of their suppositions that they make. But what I will say is this. I am angry at them, at everybody who came in. I am angry at what they did to the police officers. I'm angry at what they've done to besmirch what I thought was an excellent presidency of Donald Trump. I also disagree with your suppositions that he's the instigator of this. I've watched it. I've watched the videos you've shown. I thought that having tried lots of cases, I never could have gotten away with the selective editing that you did. I thought that I was disappointed at that. You were trying to make your case. You and I disagree on some of these things, Mr. Raskin. Some of these things I think we can. I'm trying to say at some point, while we have fundamental disagreements on January 6th, maybe you think Donald Trump was the instigator. I think less so than that. But I think when we start talking about specific pieces of legislation, I'm trying to understand why Democrats say, I'm not going to let you co-sponsor my colon cancer legislation because you're a Republican and the January 6th incident. I'm trying to figure out why you want to relitigate this over and over again. Well, the reality is, if you're seeking unity and you're seeking healing, then what you do is, that's what you do. You seek healing, you seek forgiveness, and you try to get it.
Let me just reclaim my time for a second and see if I can
Yeah, go
advance
ahead.
the conversation a little bit, because I think we are at least listening to each other. As to selective editing, it's interesting that there was no presentation of video evidence about the violent insurrection instigated by the president by his lawyer. So they certainly could have done their own job of presenting it. We did 14 or 15 hours of presentation of the evidence, and they, of course, did a propaganda reel of other people using the word fight, which had nothing to do with the issue. So I'm not quite sure what the argument on the other side is, and I'd be delighted to see what you think was a misrepresentation of what took place. But in any event, but my question for you is, how are we going to move on as a Congress in a country if you say everybody's angry or upset, but Donald Trump is not angry or upset and people continue to support him? He went out and made a speech yesterday, which I watched very carefully, where he never said he was angry or upset about what had happened. Those people tried to kill us. They wanted to kill the vice president of the United States of America, Donald Trump's own vice president. They were looking for Nancy Pelosi, and they said that they wanted to put a bullet in her friggin' brain. And who says they're not going to come back again? They're talking about March 4th. And I think you can see how that would put a little bit of damper on bipartisan collaboration on other things. So how are we going to deal with that problem that Donald Trump has expressed no anger or remorse about any of the events that took place? If he had nothing to do with it, as some people are insisting, why doesn't he just denounce it?
Well, okay, so I believe he has denounced it. I think he has condemned it. You don't think he has, right? So that I find, okay, is that really the reason that I have to walk through a magnetometer? We know.
Some of your colleagues want to bring guns to the House floor.
We know.
And we don't know who they're going to use them against.
We know that in our security briefings, they gave us very clear information that there is no threat, no intelligence indicating that any member of Congress is a threat to anybody else in Congress. That's what they told us twice. The question was asked twice, just last week. When former President Trump conceded to President Joe Biden, he condemned the violent supporters who stormed the nation's Capitol. That's what he did. I mean, that's from a news report.
He did? Okay,
yes.
Well.
The point I guess I'm trying to make is,
when Donald Trump wants to condemn something, usually you know about it, right? Like Stop the Steal, which he repeated thousands of times, which was based on a lie. And it'd be nice to hear you say that that's a lie too. But in any event, when he wanted to stop the steal, he said, stop the steal. He never said, stop the riot, stop the insurrection, stop the violence. And afterwards, all I heard him say was, I love you.
Well, see, that you and I heard two very different things. I heard him say stop. And this is, I guess when Mr. Perlmutter and I were talking about overcoming this, I didn't know that when I was coming in on the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, that you and I were going to have a debate about the credibility of the impeachment process here in the House and your efforts to impeach President Trump. That if that's really what's going to happen on every bill and every thought about who gets to move to a bipartisan position, so where I get to sign on to a Democrat bill that I believe in, or vice versa, we're going to go back. But you know what? When Mr. Raskin presented the impeachment case, he presented this. Where are you on that? I mean, is that really what we've come to? Is that it? I want to know, because that's what you're making.
I'm sorry, I'm reclaiming my time now, Mr. Biggs, because we've come to a lot worse than that. We've come to an armed violent insurrection in our own building. And the question is whether we're all going to stand together against that clearly, categorically, or some of us are going to obfuscate and equivocate on it. That's the issue. And I think that is the problem in terms of us rebuilding a consensus going forward. But I appreciate your comments today, because I think you're saying at least that you were angry about the violence that took place. You were upset about it. That moves us a teeny bit forward, even though we're not confronting the elephant in the room, which is Donald Trump's refusal to condemn in a full-throated way what took place and to denounce the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and the 3% and the people that were the inner ring of that coup against America. All right, I want to come back now to Ms. Jackson-Lee, finally, because what we're talking about here with policing is really the social contract, right? Because the whole reason, if you go back and you read any of the social contract theorists, whether it's John Locke or Thomas Hobbes or Jean-Jacques Rousseau, all of them said the reason that we enter into organized society is because we'll be safer inside of it than we would be if we stay outside of it in a state of nature, which, you know, Hobbes famously described as a solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So we enter into it, and then we give up certain rights in order to get the security of being part of society. But in order for that to work, the police have got to be protecting the people and not be a threat to the people, right? And that's something that the framers of the Constitution recognized immediately. They said, we will enter into organized society, said Madison, and we will have government, but then first you've got to protect the people against ourselves in terms of random violence that takes place, but then you've got to protect the people against the government and the police, because now you've got people who are carrying guns who have authority, and how do you do it? So the work that you're engaged in is essential for us to be able to make democracy work in this century for everybody. And it's not partisan, and it's not geographic, and it's for all citizens, for us to be able to be safe and secure, right? So my question for you is, in moving forward the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, how is it that we can get support outside of all of the partisan conflicts that were created over the last 4 years, these efforts to divide the country and polarize the country against itself? But it was a very conscious political strategy. How do we get beyond that to say that this Justice and Policing Act is something that is going to give security to every single American, and also to our police officers who are part of our family too, like the thousands who defended us against that riotous, violent mob unleashed on us by Donald Trump on January 6th.
Congressman Raskin, thank you so very much for yielding, and I might say, Professor Raskin, for that very four corners understanding of who we are as a democracy. Our democracy is a continuing set of Legos or building blocks. It continues to have moving pieces, and its legitimacy and its strength comes from the idea that when things are broken, we fix it. It was certainly broken on January 6th. Not only were lives jeopardized, but we mourn the visible beating of officers in our very eyes after we saw the video from individuals who had no respect for law and order. This legislative construct, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, not only stands on the shoulders of families who have mourned, but it has a historical context. Because when policing was organized in the 1800s, they were used to capture escaping slaves. It has a racial context. What we're trying to do is to build policing for the 21st century. It could be called the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act for the 21st century. We're trying to protect police, to develop opportunities for enhanced interaction with the community. I didn't mention that we have a whole funding component on reimagining police, dollars going to communities where they will work with designing relationships, ending racial profiling, which intimidates so many, and religious profiling. It could be that you're wearing clothing that indicates you're a Muslim, or you could be wearing a yarmulke, or you could be wearing a Sikh attire, anything that shows that. And as well to, again, talk about de-escalation, training, accreditation, 18,000 police departments, and no accreditation in the 21st century. So we try to build the social contract where there is respect for the citizen that you are to protect, as well as to ensure that crime is not the dominant force against innocent civilians. If I might use the horrible or rage that we're having of incidences against our friends who are Asian Americans, we are asking police officers and the federal authorities to deal with this unseemly attack on our friends. And we will demand a response. That's law and order. In addition, let me correct anyone that suggests that eliminating qualified immunity would negatively impact recruitment, retention of police officers because they would fear being sued. I can tell you young officers are still signing up to be police officers, college graduates. First of all, the Fourth Amendment gives deference to police officers of the Constitution. We know that police officers are indemnified and they're not personally held liable for these cases. But what this does is it gives confidence to the community that they have a right when they are suffering, like the family in California that lost their son right in their home, I think in their living room, or when George Floyd's family watched it on television for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. That's why we cry out, say his name, then that's what we're trying to do, to have a cemented social contract that in fact provides the constitutional protections. And then, as you well know, Section 242 deals with making sure that there is a greater pathway for criminal accountability. And by the way, there's a statement of the administration that looks forward to supporting the House bill, working with the Senate, and moving that bill to the president's desk. That will be the social contract that will make it better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I yield back to you, Ms. Torres. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And before calling the next member, I just want to take a moment for a personal privilege to say to you, Mr. Biggs, that I hear you, and I very much, like you, want to heal and forgive. In this panel, myself and Chairwoman Jackson Lee were not as fortunate as some of you to have been led to safety. We were pinned down in the hall just across from where we are right now for 45 minutes. I didn't know if I was going to be able to go home to my family after that. I want to heal from that. But every time I see those bloody pictures of those officers being crushed, being beaten with our American flag, these are our Capitol Police officers. They were so brave when they were sent to work without the proper equipment, utilizing their bodies to save our lives. I want to take this moment to thank that officer who fired that shot right below to where I was pinned down, right below that floor, because he saved our lives. So I want to heal too, and I want to get past this. But I cannot do that until I see justice. And so far, that has not happened. So be patient with members like myself that continue to have those triggers. Because just like you, I do believe that Blue Lives Matter too. My son is a police officer and I love him dearly and I do support.
Come in so you can take pictures, please.
However, I also believe that the Black and brown officers that wear that blue uniform, that their lives also matter. So with that, I apologize to the committee for taking up some personal time. Let me now recognize Ms. Fishbach.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I just want to once again point out that this is one of those bills that did not have a hearing this year, and that 62 members of this body were not involved in the markups or had any input. And those new members actually do deserve the opportunity to be involved. And so sending these things right to the floor, I think, cuts them out. But I am just wondering, Chair Jackson Lee, how involved were the police groups? I'm very concerned about the police organizations having input into putting this legislation together, because I worked with them quite extensively in the state legislature, and I know that they, given the fact that they've got to implement things and they're involved and they are good people and they want to make sure that their profession is handled professionally and to the best that they can. And so I want to make sure that they had significant input into this legislation.
Thank you very much. We know that the Law Enforcement Partnership and National Organization of Black Law Enforcement are supporting the legislation. The major chiefs, we had a witness from the major chiefs who indicated their interest in a number of provisions. We were represented in that meeting by Chief Acevedo, Art Acevedo, who happens to be the chief of the police department of the city of Houston. And he indicated his continued interest in recommendations involving banning the use of the techniques that require manipulation of the neck, affirmative requirement for peace officers to immediately intervene and report acts of misconduct, preservation of life standard requirement in response to resistance, use of force policies, mandate ongoing crisis intervention training, mandate de-escalation training on a continued basis, and mandate cultural competence, implicit bias training, and standardization of laws and policy governing the release of body-worn camera. Many of those ideas are certainly in this particular legislation, and we will continue to work with our friends in law enforcement. So some have supported it, and we've engaged with a number of them. As we make our way to the Senate, you can be assured we will continue to work with law enforcement across the spectrum. But we are engaging with them, we're listening to them, and we hope that they will give us more ideas as we make our way to the United States Senate.
And because like Ranking Member Cole, there are a lot of organizations and chiefs in my district that have expressed concern with the legislation as it is now. And so I really think that if we are going to have workable changes, that we need to absolutely positively have that kind of support from police officers and those guys that are doing the hard work of protecting us. And I know you know Congressman Stauber. You're familiar with him, and I know that he's a former police officer, and he has offered legislation using his firsthand experience as an officer. And can you talk about how this approach is better than what he's introduced, or maybe you haven't had the opportunity to compare them?
Would you characterize his legislation briefly, please?
Oh, I guess I don't have the details of it. I know he's got it. And I was under the impression that he's had a discussion with you regarding some of his ideas and had some discussions with you about that.
Right.
Oh, I'm sorry. And maybe you're not
first of all, let me first of all say that I know that Congresswoman Bass, the Judiciary Committee, myself, the chairman, had an open mind for a very long period of time as we crafted this bill. Urgency, of course, was generated by what I don't think most Americans had ever seen in visible color, if you will, and that was the killing of George Floyd. As I indicated in my opening remarks, technology has generated a new experience, just as technology showed members of Congress who were locked down, who were frightened for their life, just as they were fearful and did not see what happened on the Capitol steps until afterwards. we're now beginning to see what's happening with police officers. But we know across America, officers take the oath to protect and serve, and they do that. I think there's a misnomer, and we'd be happy to talk to your chief or anyone else, that the provisions of qualified immunity, which is well detailed in the Cato report, that indicates that there are many protections that the officer will still have. The Fourth Amendment they will have. All that the qualified amendment does is give constitutional rights to the plaintiff as well as the officer, allows them into court. It doesn't block the plaintiff that has lost a loved one or been injured by a misconduct of a police officer from getting into the court. As relates to, I don't know if you mentioned this, Section 242, that's criminal liability. And of course, that has to do with changing the standard from willfulness to knowingly and reckless. And so we're ready to talk to officers. We truly believe that in talking to officers, they will find that this does change the construct between the community. This opens the opportunity for dialogue. As Congressman Raskin said, it creates the social contract. It builds on democracy. That's what we would like to do. This is the House version that has been subjected to an extensive markup, long hearing, and we believe this is ready to go to the floor and ready to go to the Senate, and more work will be engaged at that time.
Thank you. And I would be remiss, since there is discussion about the January 6th riot, if I didn't remind people regarding the week and a half long riots that happened in Minneapolis, that not only officers were at risk, but citizens. There was significant businesses that were burned down to the ground, a police precinct. And so, I think we can all agree that those riots are bad, but we need to agree that all of the riots are bad, and that scarred my home state in the city of Minneapolis when we had a week and a half, and it continues. There was additional, not to that scale, but certainly there was additional protests and things going on in Minnesota after the aftermath of the incident. But I did want to just give Congressman Biggs, Ranking Member Biggs, the opportunity. I know that there was a few things that he wanted to just kind of wrap up, and so I want to yield to him and give him the opportunity to just say a few words.
I'll get it right. I'll get it right sooner or later. Madam Chair, I thank the gentlelady for yielding to me, and I addressed the chair and asked if I might enter into the record two important news articles. One dated January 7th by the Associated Press, entitled "Trump Condemns Capitol Insurrection, Acknowledges New Administration to be Inaugurated," wherein he spoke out against the violence, calling it a heinous attack that left him outraged by the violence, lawlessness, and mayhem. And secondarily, there's been some discussion about whether it's hard to retain officers, and so I want to introduce a piece called "Disturbing Trend. Montgomery County sees higher crime coupled with police retention problems," and the police chief there admits that it's because partially they're losing officers because of intense public and media scrutiny of policing practices. And I thank the gentlelady for yielding, and I'll yield that.
Without objection.
Gentlelady, did my friend Mr. Biggs finish, or is he getting ready to speak? I'm asking.
My understanding is Mr. Biggs is finished.
Madam, would you be kind enough to yield? I did not hear the word Scott. I'm so sorry. We have obviously been engaged with Senator Scott, and we hope to continue to be engaged with Senator Scott. But Senator Scott's legislation does not even embrace the executive order. And as I'm looking at it, it doesn't even embrace the idea of banning chokeholds. It is relied on collecting data. It establishes a duty to intervene, and mandates body cameras. And those are all very important elements, but it does not ban chokeholds. It doesn't ban no-knock warrants in drug cases. It doesn't ban racial profiling. And it certainly doesn't require deadly force to only be used as a last resort. This is a significant moment in history. I think the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, again, captures the social contract between society and police, because we as Americans heretofore have subjected ourselves to law and order because it is part of the building blocks of democracy. But when you do not have a fair social contract, when you as a civilian, a citizen, are concerned about chokeholds, concerned about no-knocks. Breonna Taylor would be alive today if the no-lock provision was in place. And as indicated, Eric Garner and George Floyd would be alive today if the chokehold was banned. So we certainly welcome the Senate's engagement, but we could not find a way to embrace legislation that was initially offered by a very good man and very, I'm sure, committed and dedicated senator that did not have any embrace of what would need to be in a reconstruct of the social contract between people of color, the American people, and our police. Again, to put us back where we should be of mutual respect. I just wanted to correct, I did not hear you correctly, and thank you for yielding and allowing me to provide you with that insight. Thank you.
And Madam Chair, maybe I should call on Ranking Member Biggs to give us an idea. I think he may be familiar with Congressman Stauber's legislation, and if he could potentially give us some idea of how this approach provides a better solution. Ranking Member Biggs.
Thank you, Representative Fishbach. I'm embarrassed to say that I haven't looked at it recently, but I did talk with him last year when he was working on it, and is a former police chief and a rank and file officer. So we discussed everything from training, and he actually supports many of the provisions that are in here. He thinks they're good, but he also provides some additional provisions that I think are important. And I would hope that we get a chance to give that bill a good look over when this comes back on conference. So I'm sorry, I can't tell you more about that. I'm sorry.
All right, well, thank you, Ranking Member. And I think this may just show a little bit of why having those markups and having those hearings on things like this, particularly this year, would have been very important, so that there was the kind of input that we need to make sure that these kinds of legislations that's going to change the way we police have our police officers work, that we make sure that we have all of the input and that we don't rush things through, because I always haste does not make for good legislation all of the time. And so I appreciate the opportunity, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
Ms. Scanlon.
Hi, thank you. Representative Jackson Lee, I come from Philadelphia, and our former police chief, Charles Ramsey, who was also the police chief in DC, was one of the co-chairs of the Presidential Task Force on 21st Century Policing, which came out with 59 recommendations in 2015. That task force obviously was established in the wake of the shootings in 2014, Michael Brown in Ferguson, et cetera. Is there a relationship between the recommendations from the 2015 Presidential Task Force recommendations and what's in this bill?
Congresswoman Scanlon, thank you so very much for that question. And more importantly, thank you for your service on the Judiciary Committee. Absolutely right. As you well know, in the past administration, to our dismay, they dismantled pattern and practice, consent decrees, which have been lifesavers for cities like Baltimore, I believe Detroit and Chicago. And so, yes, we used the very hard work of that particular task force that really had Chief Ramsey, also the former chief of police of Washington, D.C., certainly long years of experience. So police officers were on that particular task force. And I think it came about post Eric Garner. We don't mention Trayvon Martin, but he was under color of law because of the fact that this individual allegedly was supposed to be a civilian patrol, and the same thing with Mr. Arbery. But the idea, they took a lot of that work, the chokeholds information, the idea of training was very important. The accreditation was very important. We took that and the Law Enforcement Trust and Integrity Act, which was embedded in this bill, and to be able to hold police accountable. But again, to use that term to redo the relationship between police and community, I think when you have mutual respect, you have harmony, you have the ability to work together, and you have the ability to get things done. So yes, that was a marker, if you will, that we started from, and that document was very important to us.
Yeah, and I think Chief Ramsey, in discussing the work that they've done, which, as you noted, included police forces across the country, he referred to the need for good constitutional policing. So police officers that are being held up to the standards we have to hold them to, but also are able to protect their communities. We've heard a little bit of talk about whether we need more hearings here. I personally feel like there's a lot of urgency to get this across the plate, and as soon as possible. The killing of George Floyd took place on May 25th. The bills in this package, in large part, we were able to move through the House about a month later. But that doesn't mean that we haven't lost so many members of our community since then. And I want to mention one in particular. Walter Wallace Jr. was a young man in his 20s in Philadelphia on October 26, when he was having a mental breakdown. His family called for help from 911. And when they called 911, they were sent police officers, and those police officers ended up at his house. And within minutes of arriving there, Walter Wallace had been shot dead. So he was having a mental breakdown. His mother was with him on the street, crying to the police officers, don't shoot him, he's having a problem. And the police officers apparently, well, there was no de-escalation. They did not have non-lethal weapons such as tasers. How is the George Floyd Act going to help with respect to someone like Walter Wallace who needs mental health assistance rather than an armed confrontation?
It specifically addresses a new approach to policing, absolute training of de-escalation, but it requires certification. As I indicated, 18,000 police departments, some as small as 2, but no training whatsoever. There has to be a recognition of a different treatment for those who are having a mental crisis. Your constituent, and as well, you knew there was an incident in Rochester, New York, which ultimately wound up with an individual who was unclothed in the cold, obviously having a mental crisis and also maybe dealing with substance. And that person did not wind up living because a paper bag was put over their head. There are many different ways that this bill pierces into the training so that you knew the duty to intervene. What happened to the other officer, whoever was acting, with all the actors, all officers doing the same thing? Was there not one officer who felt enough protection by the law to say I should, or the obligation of the law to intervene? I think this, besides also having pattern and practice, that if there is sufficient number of these actions at a police department, then the DOJ would go into determining that and then getting a consent decree to get them to clean up their treatment of their citizens. What we want to do is to give answers to police officers and relief to those that they protect and serve. I think that's what we want to do, to create more dialogue, safety for all, and the idea that police officers will be able to be in communities, as many are across the nation, and feel that there's a partnership in protecting the community, and as well a respect for them to go home to their families. So this bill tracks the task force and really works to respond to some of those concerns.
And I appreciate that. It's been extremely frustrating to hear this whole discussion framed as Black Lives Matter versus Blue Lives Matter, because of course that is not what we're talking about here. What you mentioned with police forces wanting to have the training, materials, the equipment, just the knowledge base to be able to address situations in their communities in a respectful manner is something that we've heard. I have over 50 police forces in my district, and we hear, particularly from the smaller ones, that they need help to be able to live up to standards. So we really appreciate your work to move this bill forward, and with that, I would yield back.
Madam Congresswoman, if I might indicate that there are grant programs that we've established to help small communities and small police departments. We welcome them. We know small communities and small police departments, but we're giving them grant programs through the Attorney General to conduct independent investigations, but as well to provide them dollars to certify their officers, give them training, which will make their departments much better.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I yield back.
Mr. Burgess.
I'll hold on questions for now. I have some amendments later on, but I'll pass for this at this time.
Thank you. Mr. Morale.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me first express my gratitude to Ms. Jackson Lee for her extraordinary leadership, and she's made such a compelling series of arguments today, and I think we all have an enormous debt of gratitude to her. I wanted to not only express my support for the rule and the underlying legislation, but we all, I think, look at this through our lived and learned experience and what's happened in our community. And in the last year, 2 incidents in Rochester, New York, that I have the privilege of representing jump out to me about the importance of really having, and I don't like this term, it seems cliched, but literally a profound shift in our paradigm around policing. And I think this legislation is aimed directly at that. About a year ago, a gentleman by the name of Daniel Prude, who lived in Chicago and had a brother, Joe, who lives in Rochester. Mr. Prude was having a mental health crisis, and in the early morning hours of late March of last year, his brother called a mental health arrest called 911. The police showed up, and it was, as is wont to be often the case in Rochester, was snowing in late March. On a cold, snowy night, Mr. Prude, who was naked, was put face down in the middle of the street, handcuffed. Police officers stood around. One ultimately, even though Mr. Prude made no attempts at resisting, officer knelt on his back. They put a spit hood over his head. And ultimately, Mr. Prude was put into an ambulance, but died of asphyxiation in police custody in the hospital several days later. A month ago, a 9-year-old girl in Rochester, New York, who police had been summoned because of a 911 call, found her in the middle of a family disturbance and tried to restrain her. Her mother had indicated some concern over the young girl's potential to harm herself or others. But in the course of trying to deal with her, Rochester police officers handcuffed her. And then, because she desperately wanted to see her father, who she kept calling for, and at one point a police officer said to her, "You're acting like a child." The 9-year-old replied, "I am a child." They ultimately pepper sprayed her in the eyes to get her inside a police vehicle. These, as you can imagine, in a community in upstate New York, have led to massive protests and demonstrations about the appropriate use of police actions against these 2 individuals. Mr. Prude should be alive today. He shouldn't have died. And the young girl should have had aid and comfort in a moment of incredible distress to her. Both are African Americans. Both were treated with, and I am no expert on police protocol, police procedures, not what I have a history of knowing much about. But I do know that in both cases, a degree of humanity and care and concern and bringing together the right services to intervene would have led to far less dramatic outcomes. I think Mr. Prude would be alive today if we had a far better system of bringing mental health services to mental health arrests. I point this out only because each one of our communities has been beset by these challenges. And I appreciate the bold, decisive move to advance this legislation and much other legislation like it. But this is critically important at a time, and I really appreciate. I think Ms. Jackson Lee said this, but others have said it as well. You know, those who want to see this as a binary question of you're either for Black Lives Matter or Blue Lives Matter, it misses the point entirely. This cannot be a binary question. We can't make a choice here because it's a false choice. What we need to do is reform policing. And I appreciate my colleagues on both sides who have said many people in the law enforcement community see this as clearly as we do. That reform is not only desirable, it's essential if we're ever going to get after the deep, divisive, long history of structural racism in this country. So I just point out that my community continues to suffer, continues to be in pain. I think this action today and hopefully in the next several days when we pass this in the House, and I look forward to the Senate acting and this getting to the president's desk, but this is an important, critical step in our efforts to heal this country and to bring justice for everyone. With that, I yield back.
Ms. Morelli, if I might, Ms. Morelli.
Pisani.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to commend Congresswoman Jackson Lee and everyone who's put so much hard work into this effort. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor and look forward to it passing the House in the committee.
Thank you, Ms. Ross.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you so much to Congresswoman Jackson Lee for bringing this important legislation forward. We've talked a little bit about how some of the freshmen didn't get a chance to deal with this in judiciary or during the markup. I would just point out that this legislation has been a long time coming, and I feel very comfortable moving forward on it. I believe that the public is ready for it, has been ready for it for a long time. And before I just give my brief remarks that I had been thinking about before, I just want to say one thing about qualified immunity. I am an attorney, and I want you to know that, you know, if we say that we accept the law of qualified immunity of the past, that means we're frozen in time. It means that no one can ever be held accountable for anything where our mores have changed, where our society has changed. If we say that somebody has to have had that exact same thing already ruled on by our courts from a time past, then it means we cannot have the law evolve. I am proud to say that the Fourth Circuit recently had some evolution in the qualified immunity space this year, but we need to understand that what was okay in the past is simply not okay now. And it probably wasn't okay back then. It largely wasn't, but we can't accept that the law does not adapt to the times. And I just want to bring that up for qualified immunity. We all know that last summer our nation reached a tipping point with grief for George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and countless other Black and Brown Americans killed by police. And the nation exploded into action. And I would say in the main, that was positive action. Tens of millions of Americans of all races participated in racial justice protests in 2020, estimated to be the largest movement in American history. And I can tell you, I live 5 blocks from downtown Raleigh, and I saw people who I have never seen participate in a protest, largely Caucasians, out on the street showing their solidarity and their support during this very, very difficult moment. And so what happened? Last year, this House met the people's call with the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And I'm glad we're taking this transformative legislation up today at a time when it can become law. My state of North Carolina is no stranger to bias in policing and systemic racism. I mean, it is part of the South. But I want you to know that it has moved forward. And in my time, I worked to pass the South's first anti-racial profiling bill with support from the African-American head of our highway patrol and some bipartisan support in North Carolina. And I firmly believe that we need to take this kind of action to the national stage. This bill builds on efforts to prohibit federal, state, and local law enforcement from discriminatory profiling. And that is what is at the root of what happens later. It also mandates training on profiling and requires law enforcement to collect data on police encounters. It also creates many other critical measures that we've talked about today, but getting to this root of profiling is crucial. We have to protect our people, protect and serve our people. I'm proud to support the bill. I urge my colleagues to do the same, and I yield back.
I know, I'm a milk chocolate kind of guy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. May I just respond to very briefly to unless you're going to give us.
Because we are way beyond our time.
Thank you so very much. Congressman Ross, thank you so very much for that summarization. And to Mr. Morelli, let me point you to section 306 in the legislation. Thank you for your words dealing with crisis intervention, because police officers should not and do not want to be social workers. And so we've looked at that and we understand that is something that needs to be corrected for the relationship to be strengthened. But we also know that that behavior of those officers evidence police misconduct, or at least bad judgment. And a gentleman lost his life, and a young girl is probably traumatized for the rest of her life. As it relates to the issue of qualified immunity, Congressman Ross, thank you for both your interpretation or your analysis, as well as your work on interracial profiling, which is in this legislation against racial and religious profiling, where we've seen people lose their life because they have been profiled. And that is a young autistic young man in Colorado who was stopped on the streets and misidentified. And he was stopped primarily because he was an African-American. So the names that we called out today, Eric Garner, Michael Brown, and Laquan McDonald, Tamir Rice, Walter Scott, Freddie Gray, Sandra Bland, Robbie Tolan, Pamela Turner, Danny Ray Thomas, Abdou Diablo, Sean Bell, only a few numbers, Mr. Blake, Mr. Brooks, Mr. Aubrey, just a few names that we were able to see because of technology, just a sample of why we need this renewed responsibility and relationship between police and community. So I would ask my colleagues to realize that the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act has life. It has families who are mourning. It has the George Floyd family who every day has to be reminded of 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And what I will just say is that it is constitutionally grounded, and it gives us an opportunity for a new start for police and community, and no way diminishes the respect for law enforcement or diminishes the respect for the rights of all people. And I would ask my colleagues to have this legislation go to the floor and for us to be able to debate it. I thank Karen Bass, Chairman Nadler, the Judiciary Committee, Congressional Black Caucus, and all of my colleagues, almost 200 that are sponsoring this time. And we look forward to more of those on the floor of the House. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Does any other member of the committee wish to ask a question? Seeing none, I would like to thank our witnesses for their testimony. You are now excused. I want to welcome our next panel, Honorable Pete Stauber and Honorable Debbie Lesko from Arizona.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for providing, Ms. Lesko, thank you for providing testimony today. Any written materials that you submit to rules documents at mail.house.gov before the conclusion of this hearing will, without objection, be entered into the record. I now recognize the gentleman, Stauber from Minnesota.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's great to be with you all, and I've listened to the dialogue, wonderful dialogue throughout the afternoon.
You're very low volume, sir. Can you speak up or get closer to your mic?
Okay. I just appreciate the opportunity to be with you all today, and for the opportunity to speak on my amendment to HR 1280, the George Floyd Justice Act and Policing of 2021. My amendment, which is a substitute amendment, would replace the language HR 1280 with my bill, the Justice Act, legislation that received bipartisan bicameral support last Congress. You know, before I had the privilege of serving my constituents in the House of Representatives, I served my hometown of Duluth, Minnesota as a law enforcement officer for over 2 decades. You know, when I watched the George Floyd video of George Floyd dying at the hands of Minneapolis police officers who served under the same oath, I was at a loss for words. What I saw in that video goes against everything I stood for as a law enforcement officer. With over 2 decades of experience, however, I can tell you that the overwhelming majority of police officers are good and moral people. No one dislikes a bad police officer more than a good police officer. They dedicate their lives to keeping their community safe, sometimes placing themselves in harm's way in order to do so. I might not be here today without the actions of the Duluth Police Department. You see, on December 15th of 1995, a career criminal tried to take my life. I was off duty at the time, and he shot through my truck window, and the bullet struck me in the head. By the grace of God, I'm here today. And as I waited for that criminal to finish me off, because I had no idea who was coming after me, I heard the police sirens. And I couldn't wait for those sirens to get closer because I knew help was on the way. And as those sirens got closer and louder, I said, I prayed, please, whoever's trying to kill me, don't do it. And when the first squad car came into that gas station and raced and parked next to my vehicle, I knew at that time that whoever was trying to take my life was not going to do it because I had a police officer with me. So every time for 23 years that I turned on those red lights and sirens, it meant whomever is in danger, you hear the sirens, we're coming to you. We're going to help you, whatever it is you called for. Hang on, we're going to be there. With all this in mind, I know that members of this body do not want to inadvertently make our communities and law enforcement officers less safe. But the Justice and Policing Act will make that a reality. And that is why I'm asking you to accept my amendment. The Justice Act that Senator Scott and I wrote together, he wrote it coming from his perspective as a Black man growing up in South Carolina. I wrote it as from my perspective as a white male police officer in the state of Minnesota. The Justice Act increases body cameras and implements duty to intervene and de-escalation training. It improves hiring and recruitment practices